The legion commanded by Caesar was no longer the same force that had once stood against Hannibal. In its structure and behaviour, it had moved away from the flexible legion of the Second Punic War and, in many ways, had drifted closer to the dense formations once used by the Greek phalanx. The earlier Roman legion had relied on carefully spaced units, arranged in a staggered pattern that allowed movement, rotation, and recovery under pressure. Each soldier occupied a wide, personal space, and the formation was built to absorb a shock without losing cohesion. That older legion was formed from the most reliable element of Roman society. It was made up of citizens who served not only out of obligation, but out of pride. Military service was tied to social standing, and participation in war was both an honour and a responsibility. Over time, however, this system began to erode. Wealth changed priorities. Civic duty lost its central place. Military service became something to avoid rather than seek. As this shift unfolded, the composition of the army changed with it. Soldiers were no longer drawn primarily from land-owning citizens. Instead, men were recruited for their physical strength alone. Loyalty slowly transferred away from the state and toward individual commanders. The weapons remained familiar, but the character of the army did not. Trust within the ranks weakened, formations tightened, and the open spaces that once allowed flexibility were reduced. What had been a carefully layered citizen force became a mass of uniform units, organized into fewer, heavier lines. The Roman army was no longer a national militia in spirit. It became a standing force made up of professionals, auxiliaries, and foreign recruits. Siege warfare grew more sophisticated. Engineering and artillery improved. Naval power gained importance. Yet the most significant change was not technical, but human. The soldier was no longer fighting for the republic itself, but for the commander who promised pay, protection, and land. The legion that had once endured Hannibal's relentless pressure, surviving defeat after defeat without collapsing, was fundamentally different from the army that later marched across Gaul and beyond under Caesar. The earlier legion had faced destruction repeatedly, held together by discipline and civic identity, and ultimately wore down its enemies through endurance. Caesar's army, though victorious and formidable, was built on different foundations. Ironically, the battlefield formations used under Caesar resembled those of Rome's former enemies more than those of its own past. His troops often stood in dense lines, closer in spirit to the formations Hannibal himself had used in the later stages of his campaigns. Compared to the highly flexible manipular system once employed by Roman commanders, such as Marcellus or Nero, Caesar's legions appeared heavier and more compact. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It was the result of long-term changes within Roman society. In earlier centuries, military service was closely tied to property and social class. Only those who met certain standards were allowed to serve, and those who lacked wealth were excluded. The army was deliberately selective, ensuring that its ranks were filled with men who had a stake in the survival of the state. Originally, a soldier's role and equipment depended on his social standing. Later, this shifted toward experience and age. Younger men fought as light troops. Those in their prime formed the front lines. Older veterans stood behind them as reserves. Each man had space to move. Units were separated by deliberate gaps, allowing lines to pass through one another and respond to changing conditions. This system produced an army of remarkable adaptability and resilience. That army proved itself during the great wars of the 3rd century, before Christ. It was disciplined, mobile, and capable of enduring extreme punishment. Few military systems in history matched its balance of flexibility and strength. By Caesar's time, that balance was gone. Political conflict within Rome had changed the nature of service itself. The standards for enlistment were lowered. Wealthy citizens withdrew from military life. Physical training declined among the elite. The army increasingly attracted those with little to lose and much to gain. Cavalry once provided by Roman citizens disappeared from the battlefield, replaced by foreign horsemen from allied or subject regions. Light troops were recruited from distant lands. Heavy infantry, once the proud core of Roman identity, gradually lost its exclusively Italian character. One commander, more than any other, accelerated this shift. He opened the army to all free men, regardless of wealth. He removed the old distinctions between classes of infantry and standardized their equipment. Training became harsher and more professional. Combat instruction was systematized. Advancement depended on performance rather than social background. This change brought short-term strength and long-term consequences. The army became more efficient but less representative of Roman society. Soldiers fought longer, served farther from home, and came to depend on their generals rather than the state. Commanders gained unprecedented influence, as loyalty flowed upward instead of outward. As time passed, the army filled with men from the poorest layers of society, and eventually with outsiders, freedmen, and even criminals. Veterans expected land in return for service. Special units were formed with personal loyalty to their leaders. What had once been a civic institution slowly transformed into a political weapon. By the time Caesar took command, the legion was no longer the army of citizen farmers that had saved Rome in its darkest hours. It was a hardened, professional force, loyal, disciplined, and deadly, but shaped by a very different world. Its victories were undeniable, yet they came at the cost of the old Republic's military soul. By the late Republic, the Roman army was no longer divided into simple categories of Roman and allied troops. After the Social War, citizenship was extended across Italy, and the legions became a mixed force. Romans stood alongside auxiliaries, provincial soldiers, and hired fighters from distant regions. Recruitment no longer examined a man's background or moral standing. Physical strength alone determined eligibility. Character, loyalty to the state, and civic virtue no longer mattered. Cavalry followed the same path. Mounted troops were increasingly drawn from foreign peoples, with strong riding traditions. Members of the old Roman elite still appeared on horseback at times, but only in ceremonial or prestigious roles. The traditional rules for raising armies were ignored. Anyone with money could avoid service. Anyone with a strong body could carry weapons. Most telling of all was the soldier's oath. It was no longer sworn to Rome. Loyalty was pledged directly to the general. As Roman territory expanded and armies were forced to remain under arms for years at a time, commanders relied on every possible method to prevent their forces from dissolving. What had once been honourable civic duty slowly degraded into a life of paid warfare. The Roman citizen soldier gave way to the soldier of fortune. Standing armies replaced temporary levies. Mercenaries became normal. Provinces were handed over to governors who commanded permanent forces and ruled with almost unlimited authority. These territories were exploited for revenue with predictable consequences. In this transformation, Rome began to resemble the earlier decline of the Greek world. Such changes made older military structures impossible to maintain. The distinctions that once separated different types of infantry disappeared. Soldiers were now classified simply as heavy or light troops. Weapons and armour remained largely familiar, but organisation changed fundamentally. The traditional size of a legion stayed roughly the same, with several thousand heavy infantry and a few hundred cavalry. However, light troops drawn from the provinces increased dramatically and no longer formed an organic part of the legion itself. Cavalry grew steadily in importance. Roman horsemen learned from years of campaigning across Iberia, Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. Light cavalry became faster and more flexible, while heavy cavalry improved more slowly. What had once been a minor supporting arm expanded until mounted troops sometimes formed more than a seventh of the army's strength. The size of Roman armies also expanded. A field force no longer consisted of a fixed number of legions. Commanders might lead 8, 10, or more legions at once, not counting auxiliaries. War machines became standard equipment. Each legion carried dozens of artillery pieces operated by trained crews. These engines were rarely used in open battle, but they dominated river crossings, mountain passes, camps, and fortified positions. For a time, traditional formations survived. Units still maintained spacing, and soldiers still fought with personal room to maneuver. But the quality of recruits steadily declined. Unlike earlier generations trained from youth in discipline and endurance, these soldiers lacked independence and reliability. In wars against massed enemies from the north and east, Roman commanders found that open gaps in the line became dangerous. As confidence in individual soldiers fell, formations tightened. A new structure replaced the old one. Smaller tactical units were merged into larger formations. The legion reorganized into several heavy blocks arranged in multiple lines. At first, spacing remained. Over time, those spaces narrowed. Distance between lines increased to allow greater control. The front line carried the main weight of battle, while rear formations served as reserves and anchors. As this system evolved, formations became denser. Some armies deployed in 2 lines, others in 3. Files were sometimes shortened and widened to eliminate gaps altogether. Step by step, the legion transformed into something close to a solid wall of shields and spears. The flexible checkerboard arrangement vanished. The change reflected not innovation, but necessity. Discipline and patriotism had weakened. Soldiers required tighter control. Yet this solidity was not constant. Commanders adapted spacing as needed. Some legions still fought with gaps between units, others closed up entirely. The army had lost its fixed identity and now reflected the preferences of individual generals. Defensive formations also expanded in scale. Shield formations grew into massive blocks, used against cavalry. On open ground, armies sometimes marched in square formations, prepared to fight from any direction. Commanders paid close attention to march discipline. Columns were protected by cavalry on the flanks, light troops screened the movement, and advance and rear guards remained ready for sudden contact. In battle, heavy infantry usually held the centre. Auxiliary forces guarded the wings. Light troops filled gaps or operated ahead and behind the main body. Cavalry was no longer tied to fixed positions, but thrown into action where pressure was greatest. Tactical coordination improved steadily, reaching its highest level under the great commanders of the age. Meanwhile, the structure of command changed. Power concentrated in the hands of generals. Senior officers gained broader authority. Lower officers commanded standardized units. Soldiers trained constantly, while civilians no longer shared in that discipline. To prevent unrest, troops were assigned to labor projects, especially road construction and fortification work. Pay increased. Rewards became more generous and less regulated. Discipline existed, but it depended entirely on the personality of the commander. Punishments could be savage or inconsistent. Honor still existed, but it was enforced by fear rather than shared values. Victory proved that courage remained, but the motive had changed. Love of country faded. Desire for loot, land, and advancement replaced it. Soldiers followed individuals, not the state. loyalty shifted easily from one leader to another. This change was revealed clearly during moments of unrest. When soldiers demanded discharge, they were reminded of citizenship itself, a concept that once defined their identity. But these men were soldiers only. Civic pride no longer moved them. The reminder worked precisely because it no longer applied. Luxury spread through the camps. Decorations replaced simplicity. Privilege replaced hardship. Fatigue duties were abandoned for favoured units. Leadership skill flourished, not despite this decline, but because of it. At the same time, military engineering advanced rapidly. Camps became fortresses, walls thickened, ditches deepened, towers multiplied, obstacles covered approaches. Even battlefields were prepared with defensive works. Temporary fortification became a Roman specialty. Siege warfare reached new levels of complexity. Surrounding cities, cutting them off, advancing under cover, mining beneath walls, and overwhelming defences became standard practice. Artillery dominated both offence and defence. Missiles of stone, wood, and fire filled the sky. Naval power expanded alongside land warfare. Forests were reserved for shipbuilding. Fleets grew diverse and heavily armed. Warships carried rams, towers, missile crews, and boarding equipment. Fire was used deliberately as a weapon. Crews consisted of rowers from the lowest classes and soldiers trained for combat at sea. Command structures mirrored those on land. Fleets operated with discipline and ceremony. Harbours were fortified, entrances chained, and ships drawn ashore each night when possible. Naval battles followed careful formations. Signals initiated combat. Missiles opened the engagement. Ramming, boarding, and fire decided the outcome. Victory was celebrated with ritual and reward. In this late Republican age, the most striking campaigns did not come from the character of the army itself. They came from the people who commanded it. Victories rose or fell with the temperament, discipline, and ambition of the general. The old idea that Rome won its wars through the shared virtue of citizen soldiers was fading. Power now centered on exceptional individuals, and many of those individuals were not simply fighting foreign enemies. They were also positioning themselves to dominate the state. The career of Marius shows this shift clearly. His success in North Africa did not rest only on his own decisions. A large part of it depended on the abilities of the young officer serving under him, a man who would later become his bitter rival. The broader conquest of Numidia was largely secured by earlier leadership in the same war, while the final capture of the Numidian king came through sharp political and military manoeuvring led by others. Marius benefited from all of this, and his name absorbed much of the credit. His reforms became attached to him so firmly that they overshadowed the fact that many of his battlefield achievements were inseparable from the political environment that carried him upward. Yet there is one part of his story that cannot be reduced to politics. When a massive northern threat pressed toward Roman territory, Rome faced one of the most serious crises in its history. A disastrous defeat in southern Gaul wiped out a huge Roman force and an even larger crowd of camp followers. The loss was so severe that Romans compared its shock to the worst catastrophes of earlier generations. Leadership had failed, coordination had collapsed, and thousands paid for that failure with their lives. In the aftermath, Rome turned to Marius and sent him north to contain the emergency and restore order. He had time to rebuild because the invading peoples did not march directly into Italy. Instead, they drifted westward, testing other routes and other lands until resistance and harsh terrain forced them back. They moved like a vast migrating tide, shifting direction when blocked, then rolling forward again toward Roman-controlled territory. Marius established a strong position near the great river routes of the region. He tightened Roman influence amongst local tribes, punishing those who wavered and securing the loyalty of those who could be kept stable. Most importantly, he positioned his forces to guard the limited access points that led toward Italy. The invaders were not moving as one single body. They split, and this division mattered. One group turned toward the Alpine routes that eventually spilled into Italy. The other, known for its size and terrifying presence, aimed to push down a major river corridor and then follow the coastline toward the mountain passes. When that second group approached, they found Marius in a carefully prepared camp. He had fortified his position with unusual thoroughness. His soldiers were trained and under control, yet their commander hesitated to fight immediately. The reason was not cowardice. He understood something psychological. His men needed time to grow accustomed to the sight of these towering, light-haired warriors, their savage noise, and the unsettling confidence with which they moved. A disciplined army could still be shaken by an enemy that looked and sounded like a force from nightmares. Ancient peoples had felt this before. The Greeks long ago had feared the vast armies of Persia in much the same way before their first major encounters. The invaders tried to provoke a battle. They hurled insults, shouted challenges, and pressed forward as if daring the Romans to come out, but Marius refused. He remained behind his defences, letting frustration and impatience build in the enemy ranks. For 3 straight days they tried to storm the Roman position. 3 times they were beaten back, suffering heavy losses for little gain. Eventually they abandoned the effort and continued toward Italy. For days their long column passed the Roman camp. Fighters, wagons, families, supplies, and everything they carried with them. As they marched, they mocked the Romans, calling out that messages could be sent ahead to Roman wives and children in Italy. That moment was the turning point. Once the enemy had committed to movement, Marius began to follow with caution. He did not rush. He shadowed them, camping nearby on defensible ground, always protected by strong works, always controlling the pace. This was the kind of war learned in North Africa: patient pursuit, constant pressure, and refusal to be pulled into a reckless clash. Only when the morale of his own men had hardened did he decide the moment had arrived. Near a Roman settlement in southern Gaul, conflict began almost by accident. Soldiers from both sides went to draw water from the same river. A fight broke out along the banks, then escalated quickly. The Romans drove part of the enemy force across the water and back toward their wagon camp. The struggle became violent and chaotic, and there, the invaders' families were drawn into the fighting. Women fought beside men, defending the wagons with desperate ferocity. Losses were heavy. But despite their success, the Romans ended the day by withdrawing to their own side of the river, refusing to overextend themselves, while the larger enemy host remained intact. During the night, Marius prepared the decisive move. He placed a strong detachment in concealment upstream in rough, wooded ground, hidden in ravines. Their orders were simple: stay unseen, then strike the enemy from behind at the critical moment. At first light, he deployed his main army on the heights near his camp and used cavalry to provoke an attack. The enemy, convinced the Romans still lacked the courage to fight openly, surged across the river and rushed uphill in disorder. This was exactly what Marius wanted. The legions met them with firm resistance. The slope and the discipline of the Roman line broke the attackers' momentum. After intense fighting, the invaders began to lose cohesion and were driven back down toward the plain. Time now became a weapon. These northern warriors were not built for long combat under the heavy heat of the Mediterranean. As the day wore on, their strength dulled. When exhaustion and confusion set in, the ambush force struck the rear. Cavalry supported the blow. The attackers, who had begun the day full of rage and confidence, suddenly felt the ground collapse beneath them. The retreat turned into panic, then panic turned into slaughter. Ancient reports claimed enormous numbers, killed and captured. Exact totals are less important than the result. One invading host was shattered, and the threat to Italy was cut in half. The other invading group had already entered Italy through the Alps, but even there the danger did not immediately become a direct march on Rome. Marius moved fast enough to join another Roman commander. The invaders asked, according to old custom, for a formal time and place to settle the matter in a single great battle, as if war were a gigantic duel. The Romans agreed. On open ground, the armies met. The result was decisive. The second invading host was crushed so thoroughly that it vanished from history. Once again, ancient writers claimed vast casualties and immense captures. Whether every number is accurate or not, the conclusion is clear. Rome survived a crisis that could have ended its future. Marius emerged as more than a general. To many Romans, he became the saviour figure of the age, the man credited with preventing catastrophe. But the story of Roman command in this era does not end with him. Another figure stands out as the most capable commander among those who rose before Caesar. He first learned war while serving under Marius, yet his temperament was entirely different. Where Marius often acted with political instinct and raw authority, this man combined calculation with daring. He used fortifications on the battlefield, not only in camps. He strengthened flanks with trenches, controlled the shape of combat with earthworks, and treated engineering as part of tactics. Contemporary observers described him as a mixture of predator and strategist, bold when the moment demanded it, and subtle when deception was the safer blade. In the Eastern Wars, his operations showed unusual skill. His sieges became models for later commanders. His battlefield methods displayed an ability to improvise against unfamiliar threats. Facing armies that included large cavalry forces and terrifying chariot attacks, he compensated for his weaknesses by shaping the terrain around him. Trenches slowed enemy riders. Barriers disrupted chariot charges. Under missile fire, animals panicked and turned back, sometimes causing chaos in their own ranks. When cavalry pressure threatened to break Roman formations, the legions adapted by forming compact defensive blocks and holding their ground until the danger passed. At the right moment, he struck where the enemy was exposed, often leading the decisive blow personally. In later fighting, he used field works not just for defense, but as a trap, gradually narrowing enemy movement until entire forces were crushed in terrain that offered no escape. Even when details of these operations remain unclear, their intent is visible. Victory through control, pressure, and calculated enclosure rather than blind collision. Meanwhile, another commander rose who would become famous across the Roman world. Yet his reputation often exceeded his true weight. His achievements were real, but many of them were built on circumstances that favoured him. He won early fame at a young age, gathered titles quickly, and often arrived when the hardest work had already been done by others. He could be courageous in straightforward action, especially when leading mounted troops in direct combat. He could also be disciplined, personally modest, and outwardly honourable, but he lacked the spark of true genius. Decisions came slowly. Initiative was inconsistent. Fortune elevated him, and steady luck protected him from the kind of disasters that reveal a weaker mind. In politics and command, he often appeared larger than he really was, partly because he became a symbol, useful to others, and partly because he held together factions that might have shattered under a more intense personality. His early rise began when he raised troops for a dominant leader during civil conflict. His daring attacks scattered enemy forces before they could unite. He received honours that men normally earned only after a lifetime of service. Campaigns in Sicily and North Africa added prestige, but these successes were eased by overwhelming force and favourable conditions. Still, his speed and energy restored Roman confidence in moments when that confidence had been shaken. The true test came when he was sent to confront a remarkable opponent in Spain, a commander who combined politics and warfare in a way that made him almost impossible to defeat by conventional means. This Spanish War was not a clean series of pitched battles. It was a long struggle of ambushes, raids, harassment, and relentless pressure on supply lines. The insurgent leader rarely offered the kind of battle Roman commanders wanted. He forced them to chase shadows, exhausted their foragers, struck them on the march, and used the landscape as a weapon. When the younger Roman commander tried to corner him near a threatened town, he misjudged the man he faced. The insurgent reversed the trap, forced the Roman to watch helplessly as the town was destroyed, and withdrew without being caught. Later, when battle did occur, the Roman commander's line suffered severe setbacks on one wing, including a moment when he himself was badly wounded. Only the arrival of a second Roman army prevented complete disaster. Again and again the pattern repeated. When confronted directly by the insurgent leader, the Roman commander struggled. Gains came slowly. Even when large rebel forces gathered, they often dissolved suddenly after reverses or internal discouragement, only to return later. The war drained both Italy and Spain, and it ground on for years. Many in Rome began to fear the insurgent as a new Hannibal, though the strategic threat was never truly that large. His brilliance lay in matching his skills to the terrain and to the kind of irregular war Spain demanded. The conflict ended not through a decisive Roman genius stroke, but through assassination. With the rebel leader gone, the resistance collapsed quickly under less capable hands. Rome celebrated a victory, but it was not a triumph that proved greatness in the man most loudly praised for it. Later, in a very different arena, that same commander showed sharper ability. The Mediterranean had been plagued by piracy that strangled trade and threatened food supplies. Given extraordinary authority, he approached the problem with practical organization. He divided the sea into sectors, assigned commanders to each, and hunted pirates systematically. He cleared key shipping lanes first, restoring grain traffic and calming panic in Rome. He also understood that mercy could be a weapon. By offering surrender and resettlement to many, he broke pirate networks faster than terror alone could have done. In a remarkably short time, the sea routes reopened and commerce recovered. The public hailed him as a saviour, though the achievement was more efficient policing than heroic war. In the east, a different general had already been fighting a major conflict against powerful kings and had carried the campaign deep into enemy territory. He won major battles, took cities, crossed great rivers, and broke the confidence of rival courts. Yet his own troops eventually mutinied, limiting what he could finish. Even so, his years of campaigning weakened the eastern powers and prepared the ground for whoever followed. When the famous commander arrived to replace him, he had large forces and a strong strategic position. The enemy king, no longer able to rely on key allies, sought peace but refused unconditional surrender. The Roman advanced carefully, refused to be dragged into endless pursuit, and shifted his approach to cut into the enemy's heartlands. Eventually, he executed a well-timed maneuver that placed his army on heights above a narrow valley, unseen. The enemy marched into the trap and camped without realizing the danger. A night attack followed. The camp was overwhelmed before resistance could form. The king escaped, but his army was effectively destroyed. After that, the surrounding monarchs submitted. Territories were reorganized. Taxes and tribute flowed into Roman hands. The commander's name spread across the empire, as the man who had subdued the East. Yet the deeper truth remained. Much of that conquest was the completion of work begun by others, accomplished through caution and superior resources rather than daring creativity. Where earlier commanders had taken risks to carve openings, this one moved only when the advantage was overwhelming. Gaius Julius Caesar entered the world at the start of the 1st century before the Common Era, born into a Roman family that carried real weight in public memory. The Julii were considered ancient, and they liked to present themselves as more than merely respectable. Their story was tied to Rome's earliest legends, and Caesar grew up in a household where ancestry was treated as a form of political capital. His father had reached high office and died while Caesar was still young, leaving much of the responsibility for his upbringing to his mother. Aurelia was remembered as disciplined, intelligent, and unusually steady in character. She managed his education closely, and Caesar's natural ability allowed him to benefit from that careful guidance more than most youths of his rank. From an early age, he was trained to move easily in both the social and intellectual worlds of Rome. One of his teachers had been shaped by the learning of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the result was a young aristocrat who could speak with confidence, absorb complex ideas quickly, and present himself with polish. His body, at first delicate, was strengthened through deliberate exercise. He built endurance and learned to tolerate fatigue. He did not live like a hardened soldier in those years, yet he formed habits that later made prolonged hardship possible. He rode exceptionally well, practiced athletic training seriously, and accustomed himself to exposure and travel. In appearance, he stood out. His manner was open, often charming, and he carried himself with confidence. His face was expressive rather than conventionally perfect, with sharp eyes and an alert look that suggested constant thought. He was careful with dress and grooming to a degree that drew comment. That attention to appearance could be mocked as vanity, but it also reflected a broader instinct. Caesar understood presentation, and he understood how closely Rome watched the smallest details of public men. His health, though generally strong, was not flawless. At times, he suffered nervous episodes, yet these did not define him or keep him from demanding activity. His lifestyle was not built on indulgence. He could be moderate in habits, while still enjoying the pleasures available to a man of rank. Caesar's mind developed alongside his body. He read widely, loved art, and moved comfortably in both Latin and Greek culture, as many educated Romans did. He wrote with clarity and force and gained a reputation for clean, direct style. Poetry was not his strongest gift, but oratory was. Those who heard him speak remarked on the natural authority in his voice and presence, the lack of artificial performance, and the way he could hold attention without forcing it. He also possessed a memory strong enough to impress contemporaries, who were not easily impressed. He could remain calm under provocation, and could disarm hostility with courtesy. These traits mattered in a society where personal relationships, public performance, and political survival were inseparable. As a teenager, he received early appointments that signalled promise. He was drawn into the normal pattern of aristocratic alliances through engagements and marriage. Yet what becomes notable in his story is not the routine of elite life, but the first moment he refused to bend. When a powerful political figure seized Rome and began reshaping the city by force, Caesar was pressured to cut ties with the faction now considered dangerous. He was ordered to divorce his wife because of her family connections. Caesar refused, directly and without disguise. That choice came with immediate penalties: loss of position, loss of wealth, and real personal danger. In an age when many men dissolved marriages as casually as they changed political partners, This refusal revealed something hard inside him. It was not sentimental softness. It was a decision to set a boundary and accept the cost. For a time he went into hiding, protected by friends and by the uncertainty of a city still settling after civil violence. Eventually, he was spared. Yet he understood that remaining in Rome was risky. The political struggle was not finished, only paused, and his presence would pull him into it before he had the power to control the outcome. He chose distance. He travelled east, spent time in royal courts, and gained early experience in military and diplomatic duties. In one siege, he earned a high honour for saving a fellow Roman's life. This was not the achievement of a seasoned commander, but it showed a willingness to act under pressure and a desire to be seen acting. He also served in operations at sea against piracy, and this period added to a reputation that was already beginning to spread. During a journey, he was captured by pirates and held for ransom. Instead of collapsing into fear, he treated the situation as if it were temporary inconvenience. He demanded that his captors ask for a higher ransom as though their first price was insulting. While the money was gathered, he spoke to them, joked with them, and behaved less like a prisoner than like a man waiting for business to finish. He promised he would return and punish them. They laughed. When he was released, he immediately raised forces, hunted them down, recovered the money, and carried out the threat. The episode became a story repeated for decades, because it captured something essential. Caesar did not simply endure events, he answered them, and he did it quickly. After studying further in a major centre of learning, he launched himself back into public life. Rome, at that moment, rewarded boldness in the courts. Young men rose by prosecuting famous figures and attacking corruption, especially when those attacks could be framed as moral courage. Caesar chose this path and rapidly gained attention. His speeches made him known as more than a well-born youth. They marked him as a man with talent and nerve. Yet he did not rush into the most dangerous struggles immediately. He avoided serving under commanders whose politics he opposed, not because he rejected military experience, but because he refused to be trapped on the wrong side of a conflict that was still evolving. It was a pattern that would define him. He could be daring, but he did not waste himself in battles that offered no strategic gain. Step by step, he climbed the political ladder. He held financial offices, judicial responsibilities, and major religious positions. He spent lavishly to gain popularity and accepted enormous debt as the price of building influence. The scale of his borrowing was extraordinary, but it matched his sense of future. He believed that power would repay it, and he behaved as if defeat was not a real possibility. Eventually, a leading figure of immense wealth agreed to support him, expecting that Caesar's rise would create profit and leverage in return. With that security, Caesar took a provincial command in Iberia. There, he found a frontier that was not neatly controlled. Lowland communities suffered raids from upland groups who did not respect Roman authority. Caesar expanded his forces and moved fast. Much of the campaign is lost in detail, but the outline is clear. He did not tolerate uncertainty. He struck into difficult terrain, forced submission, and pushed pressure outward until resistance broke. When opponents attempted to lure his troops with distractions and plunder, discipline held. He controlled his men. When rebels tried to block his retreat through harsh ground, he changed direction, fought through where the terrain favoured him, and drove the enemy toward the coast, where they could not vanish into mountains. At one point, the enemy took refuge on ground, protected by water and tides, difficult to reach under attack. Caesar's first attempt failed, and men were lost. He did not abandon the objective. He paused, secured the situation, called for ships, and returned with the means to finish what was possible. Once he had the tools he needed, the resistance collapsed. He then moved along the coast, projecting Roman power in ways that impressed communities unused to seeing such naval strength. The effect was not only military, it was psychological. Towns submitted because they understood what had arrived. The campaign brought him acclaim, wealth, and the loyalty of soldiers who had now seen his leadership in action. He used the results in the most practical way, rewarding his troops generously and eliminating his debts. Money mattered to him, but not as a miser's obsession. It was fuel. It bought loyalty, created momentum, and built the foundation for something larger. His ambition was obvious, and it was not unique. Every major Roman figure of this era was driven. What separated men was not the presence of ambition, but the direction it took and the methods used to satisfy it. Caesar's ambition was personal and expansive. He measured himself against the greatest names of history and felt impatience at having achieved so little compared to them. That hunger shaped his next choice. He had earned the right to celebrate a triumph for his provincial victories, but he set the honour aside in order to pursue the highest office in Rome. The calculation was clear. A ceremony could be postponed, but a political opening might not return. By this time, the Roman system was failing to manage its own power struggles. The Senate could not contain the rival ambitions tearing at the state. One powerful commander returned from the east, expecting rewards for his veterans, only to be blocked. The refusal created a rupture that Caesar understood how to use. He joined that commander and another immensely wealthy figure in a private political agreement. Together, they could dominate elections, laws, and appointments. Through this alliance, Caesar won the consulship, pushed through legislation with relentless energy, and secured a long-term military command in the northern provinces. This appointment was the turning point. It gave him legions, time, and a theatre where renown could be earned on a scale that Rome could not ignore. Before leaving, he strengthened personal bonds by arranging marriages that tied his fate to the alliance. Then he departed. Politics did not vanish from his mind, but it moved behind the larger stage of war. The region he was going to command carried a special weight in Roman fear. For centuries, peoples from the north had threatened Italy, and the memory of old invasions still haunted the city. Any commander who could end that danger permanently would be celebrated beyond ordinary measure. Caesar understood this better than most. He also understood that the land beyond the Roman frontier was divided internally. Many communities were brave, wealthy, and capable, but they were not unified. Rivalries, patron-client dependencies, and shifting coalitions weakened any shared resistance. Even before Caesar arrived, instability was rising. Reports reached Rome of conflict among allies and pressure from groups moving toward new land. One major people in the Alpine region prepared to abandon their homeland entirely, seeking richer territory beyond. Such a migration could tear open the entire balance of power, crush weaker communities, and pull Rome into a chain of emergencies. Caesar moved quickly to block the easiest route, building defences and forcing the migrants to choose a harder path. As they moved, they began to ravage lands along the way, and local groups appealed for protection. Long before the moment when events finally began to unfold, news of the Helvetii migration had already reached Julius Caesar. For nearly 2 years, the Helvetii had been openly preparing to abandon their homeland, and Caesar was known for his exceptional ability to gather intelligence. Although still in Rome, delayed by political disputes and legislative struggles, he followed developments in Gaul with close attention. War was not a surprise to him. It was an expectation. When the triumvirate divided their provinces, Caesar deliberately chose Gaul. His goal was not merely to shield Rome from future invasions, but also to build something far more personal and enduring: a loyal army. In the unstable politics of the late Republic, military power was the foundation of lasting influence. Caesar did not separate Rome's interests from his own. He acted for the Republic, yet the Republic increasingly moved through him. By early spring of 58 BCE, events could no longer be delayed. Caesar left Rome at once and reached Geneva in just 8 days, an astonishing pace for the time. Roman forces in Transalpine Gaul were minimal. Only the 10th Legion was present. Caesar immediately ordered it forward while commanding the province to raise additional troops as quickly as possible. To block the advancing migration, he ordered the destruction of the bridge at Geneva, buying precious time. When the Helvetii learned of Caesar's arrival, they sent a delegation of their most prominent leaders. They requested permission to pass peacefully through Roman territory, explaining that no alternative route remained. They promised discipline and restraint. Caesar remembered well that the same people had once destroyed a Roman army and killed a consul. He had no faith in their assurances. Allowing nearly 400,000 people to cross the province would devastate the land, and once beyond it they would become another enemy to defeat while leaving their homeland open to German settlement. Yet Caesar did not refuse them outright. He received the envoys politely and asked them to return in 2 weeks for his answer. The delay was intentional. While the Helvetii waited, Caesar moved with remarkable speed. Along the left bank of the Rhine, from Lake Geneva to the Jura, he ordered a system of fortifications. These were not continuous walls, but carefully positioned strongpoints, using the river itself as a natural barrier. With limited manpower, Caesar fortified only the locations where crossings were possible, and placed garrisons where rapid concentration was feasible. Despite clear signs of Roman resistance, the Helvetii waited. Whether they trusted Caesar's words or underestimated his resolve remains unclear. When their envoys returned, Caesar rejected their request and warned that force would be used if they attempted to cross. A few probing attacks and night crossings failed. The Helvetii had lost 2 weeks and were forced to seek another route. They turned to the Sequani, whose territory lay along the Jura mountains. Unable to secure permission alone, they relied on Dumnorix of the Aedui, a powerful noble with personal ties to Helvetian leadership. Through his influence, passage was granted, with hostages exchanged and promises of restraint. News of this reached Caesar quickly. Learning that the Helvetii were moving toward the Atlantic coast and Roman allied regions, he decided to act again. Leaving his fortifications behind under Labienus, he rushed into northern Italy, raised 2 new legions, recalled 3 veteran ones, and crossed the Alps by forced marches. Despite resistance from mountain tribes, he pushed through with speed that astonished contemporaries and reached central Gaul in little more than a week. By the time Caesar arrived, the Helvetii had already crossed into Aeduan territory, plundering mercilessly. Appeals flooded in from Roman allies, all begging for protection. Caesar demanded cavalry support, relying heavily on Gallic horsemen, as he often did. Though effective, this decision carried risks, especially when command remained in native hands. With 6 legions now assembled, Caesar advanced. Near the Saone, he learned that most of the Helvetii had crossed the river, leaving 1 canton behind. Moving swiftly by night, he struck the isolated group at dawn, destroying it almost completely. The blow was severe, yet the main body remained vast and well supplied. Caesar crossed the river with ease and followed cautiously. The Helvetii sought peace but refused to give hostages. They continued westward, while Caesar shadowed them closely, restricting their foraging. Supplies grew scarce, tensions rose, and betrayal within allied ranks became evident. Dumnorix was exposed as working against Roman interests, but spared for political reasons, though placed under watch. Eventually, Caesar attempted an ambush, nearly succeeding. A single false report ruined the plan. The opportunity vanished. Short of supplies and needing grain, Caesar turned toward Bibracte. The Helvetii misread this as retreat and attacked. The battlefield favoured Rome. Caesar positioned his veterans on the slope, reserves behind, baggage secured. The Helvetii advanced in dense formation, shields locked, absorbing the first volleys. Combat was fierce and prolonged. Roman discipline and weaponry gradually broke the enemy line, but a sudden attack from the rear forced Caesar to reorganize mid-battle, forming a second front under extreme pressure. For hours the struggle continued. Only at nightfall did Roman endurance prevail. The Helvetii fought to the last, even women and children joining the defense of their wagons. When it ended, their losses were catastrophic. Those who escaped fled until starvation forced surrender. Caesar imposed harsh terms but allowed the survivors to return home, rebuilding their settlements under Roman supervision. One fleeing group was destroyed entirely. After the Helvetii were broken and driven back, a new mood spread across Gaul. Tribal leaders, sensing that a major force had arrived and would not simply pass through and leave, organized a wide council of peoples with Caesar's approval. Envoys came from many regions, not to challenge him, but to test what kind of Roman commander he was and what his presence would mean. They had dealt with Roman officials before, yet this consul felt different, faster, sharper, and far more dangerous. Among the delegations were the Aedui, the Sequani, and the Arverni, led by the assiduan noble Divitiacus. Their appeal focused on a threat that had been growing beyond the Rhine. A German king named Ariovistus had entered Gallic affairs as a hired ally, invited in to help the Sequani and Arverni against their rivals. But once his armies had tasted victory and rich land, he no longer behaved like a temporary partner. He seized a large portion of territory as payment, demanded tribute, and began pressing for even more ground to settle fresh arrivals from his people. Tens of thousands had already crossed the Rhine, and more were rumoured to be gathering behind them, ready to follow. The Gallic tribes described not only dispossession but humiliation. Ariovistus had taken hostages from noble families and treated them as tools of fear. The Aedui, once proud allies of Rome, had been forced to accept conditions that amounted to silence and submission. They were made to swear they would not even appeal to Rome again. By the time their envoys stood before Caesar, the situation was no longer an ordinary tribal conflict. It looked like the beginning of a permanent German foothold in Gaul. Reports about Ariovistus's wider people also carried a hard edge. The Suebi were described as the most formidable of the German nations, famous for their harsh discipline and relentless warfare. Their society was organized around a constant cycle of war and labor, with large bodies of men alternating between fighting and maintaining the resources that kept the fighters fed. They were said to be physically powerful, hardened by strict habits, and contemptuous toward outsiders. Their lands were imagined as vast and austere, with long stretches of forest and empty borders created by the devastation of their neighbours. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less than the central point. These were not raiders looking for loot, but a force capable of migration, settlement, and long-term expansion. Caesar understood what was at stake. If large German groups crossed into Gaul freely and succeeded, they might continue pushing south and west, eventually reaching the Roman province and even Italy, as earlier northern peoples had done generations before. The Aedui also carried special political weight, long treated as Rome's partners and deserving protection. Beyond that, Caesar had his own larger vision. He had not come north simply to guard provincial borders. His actions already suggested a broader design: to bring Gaul under Roman control and to build the kind of military power that could shape Rome itself. Removing the Germans from Gaul was not a side issue. It was a necessary step if the region was to be dominated, rather than merely managed. Caesar opened contact by sending messengers to Ariovistus and proposing a meeting. The reply came back cold and defiant. Ariovistus did not speak as a subordinate or a negotiator seeking compromise. He spoke as a conqueror. He implied that if Caesar wanted an audience, Caesar should come to him. He also questioned why Rome had any business interfering in lands he claimed to have won by the sword. It was bold language, and it carried something more than insult. It was a warning that this was a rival who would not be intimidated by titles. Caesar answered in the language of Roman authority. Ariovistus had been officially recognized as a friend of Rome, and that recognition carried expectations. Caesar demanded that no more Germans be brought across the Rhine, that seized lands not be expanded, that hostages be returned, and that violence against Rome's allies cease. The message left a door open. Compliance would keep Ariovistus within Rome's favour. Refusal would bring immediate action. Ariovistus replied with his own hard logic. He had defeated the Aedui, he said, and the conquered paid tribute. That was how power worked, and Rome did the same to those it subdued. He would not return hostages, and if tribute was resisted, he would enforce it. He ended with a direct challenge, claiming that those who faced him were destroyed. The exchange made the outcome almost inevitable. Each side was asserting a right to decide the fate of Gaul. The exact legal boundaries of Caesar's authority mattered far less than his real position. He commanded a large army and held the initiative. There was no effective restraint on him except the political balance among the men who shared power in Rome, and those restraints did not reach far into the forests and river valleys of Gaul. Caesar moved like someone who intended to decide the matter by force, and he moved quickly. While these messages were being exchanged, news arrived that strengthened Caesar's urgency. German forces were raiding deeper into Allied territory, and other large groups were reported on the far bank of the Rhine, preparing to cross. Caesar chose to strike before Ariovistus could be reinforced. After arranging supplies and rationing, he marched in early August from the region where he had paused after the Helvetian War, heading toward the upper river routes that led to the German-held zones. On the march, another report changed everything. Ariovistus was moving to seize Vercingetorix, a major centre in Sequani territory, valuable for its stores and nearly perfect as a defensive stronghold. Caesar altered his route immediately and drove his army at an exhausting pace, day and night, reaching the city before Ariovistus could take it. A garrison was installed at once. Vercingetorix's position made it a natural fortress, almost encircled by a looping river, with steep heights closing the remaining gap. In military terms, it was the kind of place that could anchor an entire campaign. During this pause at Vercingetorix, a different threat surfaced inside the Roman camp. Rumours about the Germans spread through officers and recruits who lacked experience. Tales of enormous stature, savage courage, and deadly terrain poisoned morale. Some of the young aristocratic officers who had joined the army for status or adventure began looking for excuses to leave. Fear became contagious. Even seasoned soldiers and cavalry leaders felt the tension rising as panic drifted from tent to tent. Men spoke openly about the possibility that the army might refuse to march. Caesar reacted with the instincts of a commander who understood that fear must be confronted immediately, or it will grow. He summoned the leadership and spoke with a mix of cold reasoning and personal force. The route the supply situation and the enemy were addressed directly. Then he applied pressure in the sharpest way possible. He declared that the army would march at once, and if others refused, he would go forward with the 10th Legion alone. The message struck where it needed to. It turned the crisis into a test of honor and loyalty. The mood shifted rapidly. The 10th proclaimed its devotion loudly, and the rest of the army followed, not wanting to be seen as weaker than Caesar's favourite veterans. From Vercingetorix, the direct road toward the Rhine ran through difficult ground where ambushes were possible. Divitiacus advised a broader route that avoided the worst defiles and forests, allowing the army to reach the Rhine valley by more open country. The detour was not short, but it promised safety and steady movement. Caesar adopted it. By late August, after a week of marching, Roman scouts reported Ariovistus, not far ahead. At this stage, Ariovistus, perhaps surprised by Caesar's speed, requested a conference. The meeting was arranged in open ground between the camps, with only cavalry escorts. Caesar did not trust the situation. To ensure loyalty, he relied on his own men and mounted soldiers from the 10th Legion, turning hardened infantry into an improvised mounted guard. The conference began with cautious formality, but tension was present from the first moments. The talks produced no agreement. Ariovistus argued that conquest gave rights, that Rome had no special claim to decide who ruled in Gaul, and that he would accept a boundary of non-interference if Caesar recognized what had already been taken. But the encounter quickly soured. As the meeting ended, German horsemen began hurling missiles at Caesar's escort. Caesar restrained his men from answering, refusing to let the scene become an excuse to label Rome the aggressor. He withdrew, and the hostility hardened on both sides. 2 days later, Ariovistus asked again for talks, and Caesar sent representatives. Ariovistus seized them and placed them in chains. Then he advanced, camping close to the Romans, and executed a bold maneuver that cut across Roman communications. His new position threatened the flow of grain convoys coming from allied regions and attempted to pin Caesar in place. It was a calculated move, aiming to win not by a glorious charge but by starving the enemy into weakness. Caesar did not rush into a reckless assault. For several days he drew up his legions in battle order, offering the enemy a fight. Ariovistus refused. His cavalry skirmished constantly, using tactics unfamiliar to many Romans. Mounted warriors supported by fast-moving footmen who ran beside the horses and fought in close coordination. The clashes unsettled the allied cavalry and kept pressure on Roman lines. The reason Ariovistus avoided battle was not immediately clear to Caesar. It was later learned from prisoners that German religious figures had predicted defeat if they fought before a certain phase of the moon. Whether Ariovistus truly believed this or simply used it to justify delay, the result was the same. He waited while Caesar faced the risk of being cut off. To regain control, Caesar copied the logic of his opponent's maneuver. He marched out in battle formation as if preparing to attack, then shifted sideways and began constructing a new, fortified camp in a position that reopened his road. Ariovistus threw cavalry and light troops at the builders, but Roman discipline held them off long enough for the work to be finished. Caesar then split his army between 2 fortified camps, creating a dangerous situation for any attacker, since a strike on one position could be punished from the other. Ariovistus finally attempted to overwhelm the smaller camp, likely believing it could be crushed quickly. The fight lasted until night. During the fighting, prisoners were taken, and Caesar at last learned why battle had been delayed. The discovery made him decide that waiting any longer was a mistake. If the Germans believed fate was against them before the new moon, forcing combat immediately could break their nerve as much as their bodies. Caesar's next move depended on deception. He quietly withdrew 2 legions from the smaller camp and merged them with the main force, while keeping auxiliary troops visible so the enemy would assume nothing had changed. Then, with his legions formed in 3 lines, Caesar advanced toward the German position. Ariovistus could no longer avoid a decisive confrontation. His own camp lacked strong fortifications, and Caesar's approach made it clear that an assault would follow if battle was refused. Ariovistus drew up his forces in tribal blocks, placing wagons behind and along the sides to prevent any easy flight. Women and families remained with the wagon line, shouting encouragement and desperation. It was meant to trap the army into standing its ground, and it made defeat feel like annihilation. The 2 armies collided with sudden violence. Roman infantry surged forward, but the Germans met them with such speed that the Romans had little time for the usual rhythm of missile volleys before sword work began. The Germans fought packed together, shields interlocked, sometimes forming dense, protective masses that blunted the Roman push. Roman soldiers responded with brutal, close-quarter effort, prying shields apart, forcing gaps, climbing onto the pressed wall of bodies and steel, striking down into the formation. On one side, the German line began to collapse under the weight of Roman pressure. On the other, resistance remained fierce and stubborn. A dangerous moment followed when one part of the Roman line began to falter against the strongest German concentration. At that point, a young Roman commander, Publius Crassus, overseeing cavalry and able to see the wider field, acted without waiting for orders. He pulled in reserve forces and drove them to the threatened sector. The fresh udar restored the Roman line's balance and shocked the Germans at the worst possible time. The defensive confidence of Ariovistus's troops cracked. Once the break began, it spread rapidly. The German host turned from organized resistance to a running retreat. The flight carried them back toward the Rhine. Some tried to swim across, others seized boats where they could. Ariovistus himself escaped, but much of his force was cut down by pursuing cavalry. Caesar recovered the chained envoys. Across the river, German groups preparing to enter Gaul abandoned their plans and withdrew, while hostile tribes harried them and inflicted losses. For the moment, the immediate fear of large-scale German settlement west of the Rhine had been halted. With 2 major campaigns completed in one season, Caesar placed his army into winter quarters in Sequani territory under Labienus and returned south to oversee legal and political matters in northern Italy. The season had revealed the shape of Caesar's command, speed, aggression, and an ability to seize critical ground before enemies could react. At the same time, it also showed caution, occasional missed opportunities, and reliance on subordinates in moments where a different decision might have been fatal. Later, critics would argue over what he should have done differently. Some would say the flank march of Ariovistus deserved immediate attack. Others, that the raiding force sent against the new camp could have been destroyed rather than repelled. Another point would be raised about Caesar's position on the battlefield, since the hardest fighting occurred where he was not personally present at first. Yet the outcome remained clear. He achieved what the campaign demanded. Ariovistus was driven out. The Rhine was re-established as a barrier, and Gaul saw that Rome, under Caesar, would not negotiate from weakness. During the winter that followed the first season of fighting in Gaul, word reached Caesar in northern Italy that a new storm was gathering. Labienus reported that the peoples of the north, the Belgi, were alarmed by Roman victories and were beginning to prepare for war. They had watched the Helvetii crushed and the Germans pushed back, and they feared they would be next, once central Gaul was secured. To protect themselves, they began to build a wide coalition exchanging hostages as guarantees that no member would abandon the common cause when the moment of decision arrived. What Caesar had done so far had protected Rome from immediate danger, but it had also awakened a new enemy, one that many Romans would later consider even more formidable than the peoples defeated in the previous campaign. Caesar did not shrink from this development. Resistance in the north provided exactly what Roman commanders often needed: a reason to carry the war farther. If Gaul were to be pacified, the frontier would have to be pushed to the Rhine. Otherwise, new threats would always spill across the half-finished boundary. Caesar already possessed 6 seasoned legions, and he expanded his strength further by raising 2 additional legions in Italy. These new units were dispatched north under a trusted commander, while the existing army remained in position among allied territory. When the campaigning season returned and forage became plentiful again, Caesar joined his forces, likely assembling near the same strong points that had anchored his earlier operations. With 8 legions now available, Caesar could field a heavy corps of disciplined infantry, backed by a large body of allied troops. Alongside the Roman line marched archers, slingers, light infantry, and cavalry drawn from many parts of the Mediterranean and from allied Gallic communities. Behind them followed the non-combatant mass that always travelled with an ancient army: servants, drivers, merchants, and camp followers, so numerous that the moving column could resemble a migrating town. Scouts and informants provided early confirmation that the Belgae had indeed raised a large army and were assembling north of the river, later known as the Ain. Caesar chose not to wait for them to complete their plans. In late spring, he broke camp, organised supplies, and began a fast march toward the Belgian frontier. The logic was simple: strike before the enemy is fully prepared, and the enemy's strength may dissolve before it can be used. Caesar's speed forced the situation into motion before the coalition could settle into a steady rhythm. The first results were immediate. The Remi, a Belgian people positioned closest to the Roman line of approach, submitted without fighting. Their decision was driven by fear, calculation, and opportunity. They had not fully committed to the coalition and now offered themselves as allies, providing Caesar with intelligence about the coalition's structure and its promised troop numbers. Their role would become in the north what the Aedui had been farther south: a partner inside Gaul whose loyalty gave Rome access, supplies, and local knowledge. The coalition Caesar now faced was vast and ambitious. The Belgae were often described as hard warriors, shaped by long contact with Germanic peoples and by the constant pressures of the northern frontier. Roman observers believed their ancestors had once crossed from the far side of the Rhine, and their reputation for toughness was reinforced by their history of resisting earlier waves of invaders. Reports credited the coalition with enormous troop commitments, so large they likely included exaggeration. But even discounted, the scale was dangerous. If such a force assembled and moved as one, it could threaten Rome's allies and overwhelm isolated Roman formations. Caesar's answer was to prevent unity. He encouraged disruption inside the coalition by sending allied forces into the territory of one of the largest Belgian peoples, the Bellovaci. The purpose was not only destruction but pressure. If the Bellovaci feared for their homeland, they would be less willing to keep their full strength with the coalition. While this diversion unfolded, Caesar advanced into the Remi region, crossed the Ain at a bridge point, and established a fortified camp on the northern bank. The site was chosen with care. The river offered protection and secured the supply route from the rear. Caesar strengthened the bridge position, building a fortified bridgehead and leaving a reliable detachment on the southern side to protect the crossing and respond to threats against the Roman rear. With the river and marshy ground shaping the approaches, Caesar created a position that was difficult to rush, while still allowing him to operate offensively into Belgian territory. The Belgian army soon appeared in force. They entered Remy lands north of the Aisne and attacked a local stronghold. Their siege method relied on overwhelming missiles and tight shield formations to protect men working close to the walls. The defenders, under serious pressure, managed to send word to Caesar that they could not last long without help. Caesar answered quickly, not with legions, but with specialists, archers and slingers, whose range and accuracy could make a siege assault far more costly. The reinforcement reached the town, and the Belgae, unwilling to pay a heavy price for one objective, abandoned the siege and turned to plundering the countryside instead. Shortly after, they moved closer and camped within a short distance of Caesar's position. Their fires stretched across an immense frontage, reflecting the size of their host. Caesar did not rush into a full battle at once. He tested the enemy and built confidence through repeated cavalry encounters. Measuring how Belgian horsemen performed against the allied cavalry supporting the Roman army. These clashes suggested that the Roman side could compete effectively in mounted action, and they strengthened the morale of the legions, who already knew their infantry discipline was superior. Still, Caesar understood that a single serious setback could echo far beyond one battlefield. He needed the campaign to continue as a demonstration of control. After observing enough to confirm his advantage, he prepared a defensive arrangement that would prevent his line from being enveloped. He reinforced weak gaps near his camp with additional works and placed artillery support where it could punish any attempt at a flanking rush. He also kept his newest legions as a reserve, preserving a fresh core if the situation suddenly turned dangerous. When both armies finally formed opposing lines, a marshy strip and waterlogged ground lay between them. Neither side wanted to cross first and lose formation in the mud. After hours of posturing and limited, mounted fighting, Caesar pulled back into his defences. The Belgae were unwilling to storm Roman fortifications head-on, so they tried another approach. They discovered a ford downstream and began sending bodies of men across, intending either to cut the Roman bridge and isolate Caesar, or to devastate the territories that provided him with grain. This movement could have been disastrous if successful. Caesar reacted at once. Leaving the legions behind the protection of the camp, he took cavalry and light troops across the bridge and raced to the ford. The timing was close. Belgian troops were already crossing in numbers, struggling through the water and climbing out in disorder. Caesar struck them at the moment of weakness, when formation was impossible and momentum was broken by the river. His missile troops and cavalry inflicted severe losses, cutting down those who reached the far bank and driving back those still in the water. The attempt collapsed, and the river itself became a trap where bodies and weapons choked the crossing. The failure shook the coalition. Their earlier plan to seize key points had failed. They could not draw Caesar into a battle on their chosen terms, and their attempt to cut his supply route had been smashed quickly. Worse still, news arrived that Allied raiders had entered the Bellovaci homeland. That threat pulled the coalition apart from within. One tribe after another began thinking of home before thinking of the common cause. That night, the Belgian host broke camp and retreated. The withdrawal was disorderly, as each tribal contingent tried to secure its own safety and position on the march. Caesar refused to chase blindly in darkness, wary of traps. At dawn, once the direction and reality of the retreat were confirmed, he sent cavalry and several legions forward under trusted commanders to strike the rear. The pursuit cut down many fleeing warriors who no longer had the will or cohesion to resist. The action was limited by caution and the practical difficulties of controlling a chase, but the message was unmistakable. The coalition could be scattered and punished once its unity broke. With the coalition dissolving, Caesar turned immediately against individual tribes. He marched to a major town of the Suessione and attempted to take it quickly, believing its defences might be lightly held. Instead, the walls and ditches proved strong enough to stop an easy assault. Caesar shifted at once into a methodical siege, calling up engineering equipment designed to approach fortifications under cover and to build ramps and platforms for assault. While the siege preparations advanced, Suessione forces returned to reinforce the town. Yet the speed and scale of Roman engineering had a psychological effect that ancient warfare often relied upon. When defenders saw earthworks rising and siege structures moving into place with relentless efficiency, confidence could collapse as quickly as a wall. The Suessione sought peace through the intercession of allies, surrendered arms, and delivered hostages. Caesar accepted their submission, securing another section of the Belgian zone without the delay of a long blockade. Next, he moved against the Bellovaci, considered among the most dangerous of the northern peoples. They withdrew toward their main settlement. But when Roman forces approached, their elders came forward to plead for mercy. Women and children appeared on the walls, imploring restraint. Divitiacus, the Aeduan leader whose influence still carried weight across tribal boundaries, also urged leniency. Caesar chose to accept their submission, but not without terms. Hostages were demanded, weapons surrendered, and loyalty enforced through the same system he had applied elsewhere. The Bellovaci claimed that the leaders who had pushed hardest for war had fled across the sea to Britain, a detail that hinted at future conflict beyond the coast. Other nearby peoples submitted as well, and Caesar then turned northeast, toward the Nervi, a community that responded very differently. Unlike those who calculated survival through negotiation, the Nervii rejected terms and mocked the tribes who had yielded. They were known for keeping themselves isolated from trade and outside influence, believing that contact softened a people. Their society valued hard living and infantry strength, and they were joined by allied groups determined to resist Roman expansion. Their non-combatants were sent away to sheltered ground, while the fighting men prepared for a decisive encounter. Caesar marched into their region, approaching the river, later identified as the Sambre. Prisoners revealed that the Nervi and their allies were waiting not far away. Caesar advanced to the riverbank and began preparing a camp, sending scouts forward and ordering officers to select a suitable position. The Nervii had studied Roman marching habits. They understood that legions arrived in sequence with baggage following, and that a camp under construction created vulnerability. Their plan was to strike at the moment when the Roman army was half-formed, when troops were scattered collecting materials, when lines were not yet fully drawn, and when confusion could be turned into slaughter. The Nervii prepared the ground with care. They hid their massed warriors within thick woodland on the opposite slope, keeping only a thin screen near the river to draw Roman attention and conceal what lay beyond. They also built tangled hedges from bent saplings and thorny growth, turning the approach into a maze that restricted movement and prevented cavalry from scouting properly. Roman allied horsemen probing forward were slowed and blocked, unable to see deeply enough into the wooded area to identify the true danger. Caesar, aware he was moving toward an enemy, adjusted his marching order, placing cavalry in front and keeping the most experienced legions forward. Yet the scouting was still not sufficient. The full enemy force remained concealed. As the leading legions began the normal work of fortifying the camp, soldiers scattered to gather timber and stakes, confident that the screening cavalry would provide warning. Then, as the baggage train came into view, the signal the Nervii had chosen, the ambush erupted. Warriors poured from the woods with explosive speed, swept aside the forward screen, raced down to the river, and crossed in a surge. Within minutes, they were inside the Roman work zone, striking men who were still carrying tools and materials instead of standing in proper formation. The shock was total. Orders had to be shouted over chaos. Units formed under whichever standards they could reach. Soldiers did not have time to prepare properly. Some could not even remove the protective covers from their shields. The battlefield itself made the situation worse. The hedges and uneven ground broke the Roman line into fragments. Cohorts fought in isolated pockets, often unable to see what was happening a short distance away. There was no clean maneuvering, no elegant formation changes, only desperate resistance by disciplined men who refused to collapse. The fact that they had already fought hard campaigns under Caesar mattered now more than any plan. Confidence in their leader and in their own training kept them from panic even as the line bent under pressure. On the Roman left, 2 legions managed to stabilize quickly, throwing javelins and driving forward with swords. Their opponents, exhausted by the furious rush and river crossing, began to lose momentum. The Romans pushed them back toward the ford and inflicted heavy losses. In the centre, other legions also regained footing and drove their enemies down toward the riverbank. But success on the left created a new danger on the right. As those legions advanced, they exposed the flank of the units, still under the heaviest pressure. The Nervii main body, led by their chief, struck hard into this opening. The right wing of the Roman line, still forming, still compressed, still suffering heavy losses among officers, came close to breaking completely. Inside the camp perimeter, non-combatants panicked and fled. Some Allied cavalry also lost nerve and carried rumours along the roads that Caesar's army had been destroyed. Caesar moved rapidly across the field, first toward the areas that were holding, then toward the section in greatest danger. On the right, he found the crisis at its peak. Standards were crowded together, ranks crushed too tightly to fight effectively, and the loss of centurions and officers had damaged the ability of units to hold formation. The Nervii pressed in from front and side, attempting to envelop the line completely. At that moment, Caesar did what commanders sometimes must do when systems fail. He went forward personally into the fighting line. He seized a shield from a nearby soldier and pushed into the front ranks where his presence could be seen. The effect was immediate. Soldiers who saw him in the crush regained control of themselves. Space opened. Blades began to work again. Orders became audible. Units that had been close to collapse steadied, not because the danger vanished, but because a visible centre of will had appeared at the worst point of pressure. Caesar then moved to support adjacent units, coordinating the defence and forcing the right to hold long enough for help to arrive. The rearguard legions, hearing the battle's noise and seeing the emergency, marched up at speed. Their appearance alone damaged the enemy's confidence. At the same time, Labienus, having pushed through and seized the enemy camp across the river with part of the Roman force, recognised the desperate situation and sent veterans back at a run to strike the Nervii from the rear. That Udar changed everything. The Nervii found themselves pressed from multiple directions by fresh Roman troops, and by units that had regained cohesion under Caesar's direct leadership. Even camp followers and shaken cavalry, once they saw the enemy checked, returned to the fight and helped clear the camp area. The battle turned from survival to destruction. The Nervii resisted with extraordinary stubbornness, fighting atop heaps of bodies, using the dead as cover, refusing to retreat even as their ranks collapsed into ruin. Only relentless pressure finally forced the survivors to break away. When the fighting ended, Roman exhaustion was severe and casualties were heavy. The camp was completed at once, the dead buried, and the army secured for the night. Soon after, Nervian elders came forward with a plea for mercy. They described their losses in bleak terms, claiming that almost all their fighting strength had been wiped out, and that only a handful of their leaders remained. Whatever the exact numbers, the outcome was clear. The tribe had been shattered. Caesar accepted their surrender and ordered neighbouring peoples not to attack them in their weakened state. The decision was practical as well as political. A broken enemy could still be useful as a buffer, and mercy, when it served Roman control, could be as effective as terror. The campaign against the Belgae had begun with a coalition that threatened to unite northern Gaul against Rome. By the time the Nervii were defeated, the coalition's core had collapsed, and the northern frontier was beginning to bend under the same pattern that Caesar had already imposed elsewhere: speed, separation of enemies, and decisive violence when resistance hardened. The Aduatuci had been moving to support the Nervi, but the catastrophe on the Sambre reached them on the road. Instead of pushing on, they turned back in alarm, abandoned their smaller settlements, and gathered their families, herds, and valuables into a single strong place chosen for defence. The name of this town is not preserved, but its setting is described with striking clarity. A steep hill, almost impossible to climb from most directions, with only one manageable approach. On that one side, a narrow, gentle slope, no more than a couple of 100 feet wide, ran down to open ground, and the Aduatuci strengthened that approach with a towering double wall. They were said to descend from a remnant left behind decades earlier, when the Cimbri and Teutones had marched south and were later destroyed in Italy. Whether this origin story is literal or partly political myth, it reflects the image they cultivated: a people shaped by war and migration, fiercely protective and difficult to intimidate. Caesar moved quickly to prevent the Aduatuci from recovering their nerve or attracting allies. With most of his legions, one force detached under another commander, he marched downriver toward their hill town. On arrival, the position looked too strong to be taken by a simple rush. The only practical path was a siege. Roman troops began to build a continuous ring of works around the heights, an earthen rampart backed by ditching, with strong points at intervals, so defenders could not strike one section without being answered from another. The scale of the labour was enormous, and it advanced steadily. The Aduatuci tried to disrupt the construction with quick attacks and sudden sallies, but these efforts achieved little against organised rotations of Roman infantry and the steady pressure of engineering. As the siege tightened, the defenders attempted to break Roman morale with mockery. From their walls they jeered at the smaller stature of many Roman soldiers, and joked about the huge siege tower being built at a distance, asking who could possibly drag such a machine up to their fortifications. The tone changed the moment that tower began to roll forward. When the great structure moved, closing the gap that had seemed safe, confidence cracked. Envoys appeared and asked for terms, claiming that only divine help could explain Rome's ability to bring such devices against a town perched on a cliff. They pleaded to keep their weapons, arguing that local enemies would prey on them if they were left defenceless. Caesar refused. He demanded full submission and disarmament, but offered a promise. Once the town surrendered, he would order neighbouring tribes not to attack. The Aduatuci gave in. Their surrender was theatrical. Weapons were hurled from the ramparts into the ditch below in such numbers that the pile rose high along sections of the perimeter. Gates opened and Roman troops entered to take control. Yet the surrender was not as complete as it appeared. A large portion of weapons had been hidden, and the leadership seems to have believed the Romans would relax once the town was occupied. At night, after Roman forces withdrew from inside the walls and returned to camp, the Aduatuci launched a sudden attack against a section of the siege works they judged weakest, Improvised shields were made from bark and woven materials, and the assault began after midnight, with real determination. Caesar had anticipated the possibility of treachery. Signal fires went up at the threatened point, and Roman infantry rushed along the line of fortifications from multiple directions. The fighting was fierce but brief. The attackers were thrown back with heavy loss and forced back into the town. This failed night strike changed the outcome completely. Caesar treated the breach of terms as unforgivable and imposed a harsh punishment. The surviving population was sold into slavery, the kind of mass sale that turned a captured community into profit for soldiers and contractors. Whatever the exact number, the episode became an example meant to travel faster than messengers. Surrender could bring survival, but deception would bring annihilation. While this was unfolding, a separate Roman force had been operating against coastal groups in the far northwest. The details are thin, but the result was clear. Those communities were compelled to submit, at least outwardly, and the campaign season ended with Caesar's authority expanding in several directions at once. His reputation now reached beyond the Rhine. Delegations from Germanic peoples, including groups who had previously watched Rome with suspicion, began to offer negotiations and gestures of submission. But the campaigning year was closing and winter was approaching. Caesar chose not to pursue new ventures at the edge of the map. Instead, the army was placed in winter quarters along the Loire among several tribes between the region of Orléans and Angers, spread out so that supplies could be drawn locally without stripping a single district bare. Caesar then turned south toward Italy, where politics never paused for the seasons. In Rome, the Senate decreed an unusually long public thanksgiving, a sign that the victories in Gaul were being presented as a major national achievement. The campaign's success was undeniable. A large coalition had been broken, key tribes subdued, and Roman power extended with remarkable speed. Yet it was not flawless. There had been moments of overconfidence and miscalculation earlier in the season, and the near disaster on the Sambre had exposed how dangerous imperfect scouting could be. The siege of the Aduatuci also raised a different problem, one of discipline and control, because a captured town could quickly become a flashpoint for looting, revenge, and chaos if soldiers were not restrained. Caesar tried to manage that risk by keeping troops outside the town overnight, but the very decision created an opening the Aduatuci attempted to exploit. In the end, the Romans held, and the punishment imposed made sure few other tribes would gamble on a similar night attack. During the winter that followed, Caesar did what he often did. He stayed close enough to Italy to follow events at home, while using his lieutenants to secure the frontier. One commander was sent into the Alpine valleys, south of Lake Geneva, to open and protect a major route through the mountains. Merchants and travellers had long been harassed there, forced to pay heavy dues or robbed outright. For Roman strategy, a reliable road mattered as much as a victory in the field. The mission began well. Local tribes were beaten in several sharp encounters, hostages were taken, and a winter camp was established in the Rhine valley near a key settlement. Yet the apparent calm was deceptive. The mountain clans gathered on the surrounding heights, cut the roadways, and prepared to trap the isolated Roman force before help could arrive. The attack came hard and fast. The Roman camp defences were not fully complete, and the defenders were badly outnumbered. For hours the fighting continued along the ramparts as wave after wave of attackers tried to push in. Roman soldiers, including the wounded, stayed in the line because there was nowhere safe to retreat. Missiles ran low. Exhaustion spread. Finally, the Roman commander approved a desperate solution, a coordinated breakout from multiple gates at once. The sudden counterattack shocked the besiegers, who had begun to expect surrender. Once their momentum broke, they scattered. The Romans pursued long enough to inflict severe losses, then chose not to remain trapped in hostile terrain. They withdrew towards safer territory, punishing the valley as they went and abandoning the exposed winter position, rather than risking starvation or a renewed siege. For a moment, it seemed the wider province was calm. The Belgae had been battered, German incursions checked, and mountain routes contested but not lost. Caesar even felt secure enough to look east, toward Illyricum. Then, the Atlantic coast ignited. A Roman detachment wintering near the western tribes demanded grain. Officers were sent to negotiate for supplies among neighbouring communities, including the powerful Veneti, who dominated the harbours and sea lanes of that region. These coastal peoples traded actively with Britain and Spain and possessed fleets suited to the tides and shallow waters of the Atlantic. Instead of complying, they seized the Roman officers and held them hostage, intending to force the return of their own hostages taken earlier. This act was more than rebellion. In Roman eyes, it was a direct strike at diplomatic immunity, the one rule even enemies were expected to respect. Caesar took it as an insult that could not be ignored. Preparations began at once for a naval campaign. Ships were ordered, crews gathered, and materials collected along the Loire. When spring returned, Caesar hurried back to the coast. The Veneti and their allies understood what they had provoked. They fortified their strongholds, stockpiled food, and assembled their fleet, counting on local knowledge of tides, currents, and inlets to neutralize Roman strengths. The coastal geography worked in their favor. Their towns were often built on headlands or tidal islands. At high tide, they could only be reached by boat, and at low tide, Roman ships could be left stranded and helpless in the mud. Even when Roman troops approached by land, defenders could evacuate by sea through channels unknown to outsiders. Again and again, the pattern repeated. A town was threatened, the defenders slipped away with their goods, and the war shifted to the next inlet or promontory. Without naval control, Caesar's efforts on land produced little lasting result. Everything hinged on the fleet. When the Roman ships finally arrived, Caesar positioned his army where the battle would be visible from shore, turning the sea fight into a spectacle for every soldier watching from the heights. Offshore, the Veneti sailed out in great numbers. Their ships were built for the Atlantic, oak-hulled, high-sided, solidly fastened with heavy iron and designed to ride waves and survive collisions. Roman galleys were lower, faster under oars, and better suited to calmer seas. In open water, the Veneti had the advantage in resilience and in the height of their decks, which made missile fire from above more effective. The Romans adapted. They used hooked blades mounted on long poles to cut the rigging that held the enemy's sails. When the line supporting a sail was severed, the yard fell, the sail collapsed, and the Veneti ship, built to fight under wind power, became sluggish and vulnerable. Once disabled, it could be surrounded, boarded, and taken by disciplined infantry. One ship after another was stripped of mobility and captured. The fight lasted for hours, and then nature itself intervened. The wind died. The Veneti, trying to escape under sail, suddenly found themselves drifting. Roman oared vessels could choose their targets and close in methodically. By sundown, most of the fleet was destroyed or captured, and only a small number escaped under cover of darkness. With their fleet gone, the Veneti had no real defence left. Their best warriors and sailors had been concentrated in the ships, and defeat at sea meant collapse on land. They surrendered, expecting negotiation. Caesar chose a harsher course, justifying it as punishment for the seizure of Roman envoys. The leadership was executed and the rest sold into slavery. It was not simply a military decision, but a political message, intended to deter other coastal tribes. from believing the sea made them untouchable. The cruelty of the outcome became part of the campaign's legacy, and later, generations would argue whether it was necessary discipline or needless brutality. While Caesar fought on the coast, his lieutenants were active elsewhere to prevent the entire region from rising at once. One commander operated among the Norman tribes who had gathered under a local leader and tried to draw the Romans into a battle. Instead of rushing out, the Roman commander waited behind fortifications until the enemy grew careless and overconfident. A planted rumour convinced the opposing force that the Romans were about to retreat. The tribal army rushed uphill burdened with materials to fill the Roman ditch, arriving exhausted and disordered. At that moment, the Roman gates opened and fresh infantry struck hard. The attackers broke quickly and were cut down in pursuit. News of this defeat and the catastrophe of the Veneti fleet spread across the coast, and the coalition there dissolved as quickly as it had formed. In the southwest, another Roman commander led an expedition into Aquitania, a region with a long history of resisting Roman influence. Early fighting was sharp. Local cavalry tried to lure Romans into ambush. Then infantry struck from concealment as the column moved through difficult ground. Roman discipline again proved decisive. A major town was besieged and forced to surrender after engineering works were brought forward. The war then escalated when Aquitanian peoples summoned experienced officers from Spain. Men accustomed to Roman tactics after years of conflict on the Iberian frontier. These leaders tried to fight with delays, fortified positions, and supply pressure, aiming to wear the Romans down rather than face them in open battle. The Roman response was bold. Instead of waiting to be starved into retreat, the commander assaulted the enemy camp directly. Missiles drove defenders back while infantry filled ditches and pressed against the works. Then a flanking force swung wide and struck the rear gate, the least protected section. The surprise was decisive. Attacked from front and rear, the defenders collapsed and fled into open ground, where Roman cavalry inflicted heavy losses. After this, much of Aquitania submitted. By late season, only the far coastal marshlands in the northeast remained outside firm control. Their inhabitants avoided pitched battle and retreated into forests and wetlands, taking their goods with them and offering no towns to besiege. Caesar attempted to drive them out, cutting wide paths through woodland and building protective barriers from felled timber as the army advanced. The work was exhausting and slow, and storms began to close the campaign. With winter approaching, Caesar suspended the operation and placed his forces in winter quarters across more secure regions. At the opening of the year 55 BCE, a new crisis emerged along the northern frontier of Gaul. Several German groups, long displaced by the pressure of the Suebi, crossed the Rhine not far from its mouth. For 3 years they had wandered across the interior of Germany, searching for land. Now, driven by necessity, they forced their way westward, falling upon the territory of the Menapii with extreme violence. Entire districts were devastated, and the winter that followed was spent on Gallic soil. No one could be certain whether this movement marked a temporary raid or the beginning of a permanent settlement. These migrants belonged to the Usipetes and the Tencteri, peoples already hardened by years of displacement. Their original expulsion had come at the hands of the Suebi, a formidable confederation known for its austere lifestyle and military strength. The Suebi lived primarily on meat and dairy, hunted constantly, and rejected settled agriculture. Even in winter they wore little more than animal skins and bathed openly in rivers. Their cavalry fought as both horsemen and infantry, dismounting at will, with horses trained to remain in place until recalled. Luxury was despised, wine forbidden, and discipline severe. Their territory stretched vast distances, with large tracts intentionally left, desolate as a defensive buffer. It was from this violent pressure that the Usipetes and Tencteri were forced westward. Their migration involved an immense population, numbering hundreds of thousands, including warriors, families, and herds. They crossed the Rhine near the modern lower river crossings, pushing inland toward the Meuse. Their advance was likely encouraged by certain Gallic groups, who hoped that German settlement might weaken Roman dominance. Caesar returned to his legions unusually early that spring, gathering them from winter quarters in northern Gaul. He recognized the scale of the danger at once. A hostile population of this size could not be ignored. Swift action was required before the situation hardened into a permanent threat. At a general assembly near Sambre, Caesar avoided openly accusing the Gallic tribes of complicity. Instead, he relied on persuasion, securing supplies, auxiliary troops, and a substantial cavalry force. By early May, the Roman army moved eastward through the heart of northern Gaul, advancing toward the Meuse. Reports indicated that the German host lay further ahead, spread across open ground near the river systems of the region. Before direct contact was made, German envoys arrived, seeking negotiation. They requested recognition of the lands they had already taken and proposed coexistence. Caesar rejected this outright. No German settlement west of the Rhine would be permitted. He suggested that territory might instead be found east of the river among the Ubii, who were themselves under pressure from the Suebi and had requested Roman assistance. The German envoys appeared to accept this proposal, but requested time to consult their leadership. Caesar refused delay. He suspected the negotiations were merely a tactic to gain time until German cavalry, then absent on raids, could return. Advancing cautiously, he soon encountered the enemy again. Further embassies repeated the same appeals for delay. Caesar consented only to a short movement forward to secure water for the army. What followed changed the course of events dramatically. As Roman cavalry advanced, they were suddenly attacked by a smaller German mounted force. The engagement ended in disorder, with Roman auxiliaries driven back and heavy losses inflicted. German tactics proved effective and aggressive, combining mounted shock with sudden dismounted assaults aimed directly at the horses. Caesar interpreted this clash as deliberate treachery committed while negotiations were still ongoing. Angered and determined to reassert authority, he resolved to act without further discussion. When German envoys arrived again the next day to apologize, Caesar detained them and immediately ordered a forced march. The Roman army advanced rapidly, covering the distance to the German camp with extraordinary speed. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. The German population was completely unprepared. Panic spread almost instantly. Resistance was brief and uncoordinated. As Roman infantry pressed forward, cavalry swept around the fleeing masses. Many were driven into the narrowing space between the Meuse and the Rhine. There, thousands perished either by the sword or by drowning. Men, women, and children were caught alike in the destruction. By the end, the migrating peoples had ceased to exist as organized communities. Only those cavalry units absent at the time escaped. This episode stands as one of the most violent and controversial moments of the Gallic War. Ancient and modern critics alike have struggled to justify it. Even in Rome, outrage followed. Political opponents denounced the act, arguing that it violated every accepted norm of conduct. Yet Caesar defended his actions as necessary and decisive, presenting the event as a warning to all who might challenge Roman authority. With the immediate threat removed, Caesar turned to a new objective. He resolved to cross the Rhine itself. The purpose was symbolic as much as strategic. German tribes beyond the river were to understand that no boundary could shield them from Roman reach. The opportunity arose when the cavalry that had escaped destruction sought refuge among the Sugambri. Caesar demanded their surrender. The request was refused. At the same time, the Ubii renewed their appeals for Roman protection. Rather than accept boats offered by allies, Caesar chose to build a bridge across the Rhine. This decision was as much about prestige as practicality. The construction itself was a remarkable demonstration of Roman engineering. Within 10 days, using local timber and vast manpower, a massive bridge was driven into the riverbed, anchored against the current and secured against debris. Once complete, the army crossed. German tribes withdrew into forests and wastelands, avoiding confrontation. Villages were burned, fields laid waste, and Roman columns advanced briefly into hostile territory. The Suebi themselves gathered forces deeper inland, but did not engage. After just over 2 weeks, having achieved no decisive battle, Caesar ordered the bridge dismantled and returned to Gaul. Militarily, little had been gained. No enemy was defeated east of the Rhine. No allies permanently secured, no territory held. Yet the psychological effect was considerable. The feat was celebrated in Rome, enhancing Caesar's reputation at a moment when criticism was mounting. Soon after, attention shifted across the sea. Late in the summer, Caesar turned toward Britain. The official justification rested on claims of British aid to Gallic resistance, though evidence was thin. Curiosity, ambition, and the desire for prestige played their part. Information was scarce. Merchants knew little beyond the coastal fringe. A reconnaissance voyage yielded minimal results. Nevertheless, preparations went forward. 2 legions embarked, along with a small cavalry force delayed by adverse winds. The crossing was difficult. Upon arrival near the white cliffs of the British coast, Caesar found the shoreline defended. Choosing a more suitable landing point, he moved along the coast and disembarked under heavy opposition. The landing itself was chaotic. Roman soldiers struggled through deep water under missile fire. Only bold individual action broke the stalemate. Once ashore, discipline slowly reasserted itself, and the defenders withdrew. A fragile peace followed almost immediately. Hostages promised, but rarely delivered. Nature soon intervened. Storms damaged the fleet. Supplies ran short. Cavalry failed to arrive. Sensing weakness, British forces regrouped. A Roman foraging party was attacked and narrowly rescued. Further engagements followed, inconclusive but costly. After less than 3 weeks, Caesar withdrew. The expedition achieved no lasting submission. Only 2 tribes sent hostages. Strategically, Britain remained untouched. Yet in Rome, the venture was celebrated as a great achievement. Caesar hadn't yet satisfied his curiosity about Britain. The expedition of the previous year had raised more questions than it had answered, and when he departed for Italy to deal with political matters, he left clear instructions behind. Throughout the winter, his officers were ordered to build as many new ships as possible and to repair the old ones thoroughly. A second crossing of the Channel was already planned. This time, Caesar personally oversaw the design of the fleet. The new vessels were built broader than before, allowing them to carry cavalry and heavy supplies more effectively. Their sides were kept lower so that loading and unloading on open beaches would be easier, and they could be drawn ashore without difficulty. These ships could be rowed or sailed as needed. Much of their equipment was brought from Spain. Caesar clearly understood the shortcomings of his first attempt. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to learn from failure, whether his own or that of others. Though he rarely admitted mistakes in his writings, he was quick to correct them in practice. The second expedition was intended to be more decisive, more efficient, and more convincing, not only for Rome, but for his own standing among critics. who had mocked the first landing. During the winter months, while Caesar was absent from his Gallic legions, trouble arose in Illyricum. The Pyrrhistae had been ravaging the borders of the province. Caesar immediately began raising troops, but his reputation preceded him. The Pyrrhistae quickly sent envoys, begging forgiveness and offering compensation for all damage done. Caesar accepted their submission. He had no desire to be distracted from Gaul, and hostages were given as guarantees. When Caesar returned to Gaul in early summer, he found the preparations astonishingly complete. Roughly 600 transport ships and nearly 30 warships stood ready, with many more private vessels added to the fleet. The total number approached 800. The ships assembled near the coast, closest to Britain, while Caesar himself marched inland with 4 legions and 800 cavalry to deal with unrest among the Treveri, who were suspected of inviting German tribes across the Rhine. The Treveri were powerful and divided internally. 2 rival leaders struggled for control. One gathered armed forces and prepared for war, but when support collapsed, he submitted. Caesar placed authority in the hands of the rival leader who had shown loyalty to Rome. Hostages were taken, tensions were temporarily suppressed, and Caesar returned to the coast. The entire operation had consumed the month of June. At the embarkation point, nearly the entire fleet stood ready. To reduce the risk of rebellion during his absence, Caesar decided to take almost all Gallic cavalry with him, effectively removing potential troublemakers from Gaul. Among them was Dumnorix, a powerful and ambitious leader who had long caused concern. Dumnorix attempted every deception to avoid the expedition, and when that failed, he openly revolted and fled with his cavalry. Caesar acted immediately. Pursuit was ordered, and Dumnorix was killed when he resisted capture. The message was unmistakable. By late July, Caesar was ready. 8 legions and 4,000 cavalry assembled for the invasion. 3 legions and additional cavalry were left in Gaul under Labienus, whose authority was broad and independent. Caesar embarked with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, setting sail at sunset. Despite shifting winds and heavy rowing, the fleet reached Britain the following morning. The scale of the armada terrified the Britons. Instead of resisting the landing, they withdrew inland. This second expedition differed sharply from the first. Caesar had brought adequate supplies, cavalry, baggage, and a fleet sufficient to sustain operations. He advanced inland cautiously, defeated early resistance, and captured a fortified enemy position with minimal loss. When storms damaged the fleet again, Caesar reacted decisively. Ships were hauled ashore, repairs organised, reinforcements ordered from Gaul, and the entire coastal position fortified. 10 days were spent securing the rear before operations resumed. Further inland, British resistance intensified. A unified force gathered under Cassivelaunus, a capable commander whose authority extended across central Britain. Roman infantry proved overwhelming in direct combat, but British cavalry and chariots harassed constantly, attacking and withdrawing with speed and skill. The unfamiliar tactics troubled the Romans at first, but discipline eventually prevailed. After a series of engagements, Caesar forced the crossing of the Thames despite hidden obstacles placed beneath the water. British resistance collapsed under coordinated cavalry and infantry assault. Cassivelaunus resorted to guerrilla tactics, harassing supply lines and avoiding open battle. Foraging became dangerous. Progress slowed. Eventually, several British tribes defected and submitted to Caesar, providing hostages and supplies. Guided by new allies, Caesar advanced against Cassivelaunus's stronghold and captured it quickly. Though not a decisive victory, it provided Caesar with the opportunity to conclude the campaign. A final British attack on the Roman fleet was repulsed with heavy losses. Cassivellaunus sued for peace. Hostages were taken, tribute imposed, and conditions set. With summer ending and unrest rising again in Gaul, Caesar withdrew. The army returned in stages due to lack of ships, but suffered no catastrophic losses. In truth, the second expedition achieved little more than the first. Britain was not conquered, no permanent occupation established, and no lasting control secured. Caesar had surveyed the island rather than subdued it. From a military standpoint, the campaign had little effect on the Gallic War. Soon after, disaster struck in Gaul. Poor harvests forced Caesar to spread his legions widely in winter quarters. This dispersion proved fatal. Ambiorix of the Eburones rose in rebellion, deceived a Roman commander into abandoning his fortified camp, and annihilated an entire legion through ambush and treachery. Revolt spread rapidly. Cicero's camp was besieged. Communications failed. Caesar, with only a fraction of his army available, marched at extraordinary speed to relieve the besieged legion. Using deception, he lured the enemy into careless attack and crushed them. Cicero was saved, but losses were severe. Further revolts threatened Gaul. Caesar abandoned his earlier dispersal strategy and concentrated his forces. Through swift action, intimidation, and selective force, he prevented a general uprising. Labienus independently defeated another major rebel leader, restoring temporary stability. The events of this winter revealed the strengths and weaknesses of Caesar's command. His speed, adaptability, and personal authority saved the army repeatedly. At the same time, his miscalculations nearly destroyed it. Again and again, fortune intervened where planning had failed. The Roman fortified camp proved decisive in these struggles. Against short-range weapons, it was nearly impregnable. Only the advent of gunpowder would render such defences obsolete. Scattering the legions across far-flung winter posts proved to be a serious mistake, and the cost of it was paid in blood. Yet the speed and clarity of the response that followed was extraordinary. With the situation collapsing, Caesar acted with a kind of cold urgency that left little room for hesitation. He moved with a very small escort to reach a lieutenant under pressure, taking personal risk that most commanders would never accept, and he handled hostile forces with a mix of nerve and calculation that steadied allies and unnerved enemies. It is the kind of leadership that can make earlier carelessness fade in the mind. Not because it disappears, but because the recovery is so forceful that criticism feels strangely out of place. The disaster itself raised uncomfortable questions. Sabinus had shown competence before, which makes his decisions here harder to explain. Against the warnings of Cotta and other officers, he allowed himself to be drawn into talks with Ambiorix, a leader who understood deception far better than Roman routine allowed for. Then, after leaving camp to join Cicero, he marched in a lax, unprotected formation, as if expecting an enemy to behave politely. His best option had been obvious even in the moment. Hold the camp, fortify, and wait, exactly as Cicero had done, and exactly as orders and tradition demanded. Instead, divided authority helped produce indecision at the worst possible time. Sabinus and Cotta had equal standing, so neither could impose a final will. The arrangement was structurally dangerous, and the fact that such a system did not regularly destroy Roman armies says more about Roman discipline and civic habits than it does about the wisdom of the system itself. Caesar's counterstroke had immediate political weight. Tribes that had taken up arms began drifting back to safety, calculating that open resistance was no longer worth the price. The Nervii, Menapi, and Aduatuci withdrew. Coastal groups followed. The Treveri and their dependents pulled away from Labienus. In Rome, the image of Caesar rose again, because success in war was not only measured by territory taken, but by panic prevented and rebellions discouraged. Still, the winter did not bring peace. Plans for another uprising formed, led by the Treveri, and Caesar decided the only way to break it was to move before anyone expected him to move. In harsh conditions, he struck quickly, surprising and punishing communities that had begun to test Roman resolve, then pushed operations along the lower river lands while Labienus dealt with the Treveri again. At the same time, the army itself needed rebuilding. Losses had to be replaced, and Caesar also wanted a visible display of Roman depth, a message to Gaul that destroying one legion did not weaken Rome but merely triggered the arrival of more. Through arrangement with Pompey, a legion previously raised in Gaul was recalled from leave and returned to its standards. Additional legions were recruited locally by Caesar's senior officers. New formations took numbers that carried symbolic meaning, including a replacement for the unit destroyed earlier. In practical terms, the missing strength was restored, and Caesar now held a larger force than before. After Indutiomarus fell, the Treveri chose new leaders, but they failed to bring nearby German support fully into their cause, though some Suebi were persuaded. Ambiorix joined their plans, and rumours of wider conflict spread again. Several communities remained restless, and others were openly armed despite earlier punishment. Expecting trouble around the Nervi and fearing another German crossing, Caesar chose to strike first. Before the normal campaigning season, he pulled nearby legions together at Sambre and swept into Nervian lands with sudden violence, taking supplies, seizing booty, wrecking resources, and forcing hostages as a guarantee of compliance. The shock of speed mattered as much as the destruction itself. Surprise left the target unable to coordinate. With the centre temporarily quieted, Caesar called a general Gallic assembly. Some groups refused to attend, and to combine politics with pressure, he shifted the meeting to Lutetia, close to the lands of the tribes he most distrusted. From there, he demonstrated force against the Senones and Carnutes. Their resistance collapsed into defensive withdrawal, and with hostages finally delivered, Caesar chose to accept submission, rather than spend time on fine distinctions of guilt. His aim was to smother the mood of revolt before it spread. Hostages were placed in trusted hands. The gathering was dismissed, and attention turned to the larger problem that still stained Roman prestige: Ambiorix and the memory of the catastrophe at Aduatuca. To isolate Ambiorix, Caesar focused first on the Menapii, a people who had never offered formal submission and whose marshes and wooded ground provided refuge. As long as Ambiorix could slip into their territory, pursuit would remain uncertain. And as long as German aid remained possible, the war could reignite. The plan, therefore, had two main goals: crush Treveri resistance and savour Ambiorix from protective allies. Labienus, already experienced along the Treveri frontier, was entrusted with that front. Caesar took the Menapii personally. He sent baggage and 2 legions to reinforce Labienus, then advanced with 5 legions in light order, dividing into columns to penetrate the terrain from multiple directions. The Menapii did not risk a pitched stand. Their strength was geography, not battle. Caesar answered with systematic devastation, taking cattle, prisoners, and prominent figures, using cavalry and improvised crossings over streams and marshes to keep the pressure constant. Eventually, the Menapii sought peace, agreeing not to shelter Ambiorix, and Caesar left cavalry among them as a watching hand before moving back toward the Rhine line, appearing next near Bonn. Labienus met the Treveri with a different method: deception built on discipline. The Treveri waited on the far bank of the Uerte, hoping German reinforcements would arrive. Labienus refused to give them time. He marched close, then allowed a rumour of retreat to spread, even making preparations that looked like hurried withdrawal. The Treveri took the bait, crossing the river in haste to strike what they believed was a fleeing rear. In doing so, they trapped themselves, compressed by difficult banks and disrupted by the crossing. Labienus, having briefed his commanders and secured his baggage, turned the movement into a drill rather than a panic. The line swung around with controlled precision. Cavalry hit the flanks. The shout rose cleanly. The Treveri, suddenly realizing the trap, fought poorly and broke. Many were cut down, the rest scattered into forests. The immediate danger of German intervention faded, and leadership was transferred to a pro-Roman figure who could stabilize the tribe. With Menapi restrained and Treveri humbled, Ambiorix stood alone. Caesar paused near the Rhine crossing point and decided on another demonstration across the river, partly as punishment for German support to rebellion, and partly to discourage any sheltering of Ambiorix. A bridge was thrown again with remarkable speed. A strong guard held the western end, and the army advanced into German lands. The Ubi quickly argued their innocence and pointed to the Suebi as the true source of aid. Caesar used Ubian scouts to locate Suebian movements, and learned they had withdrawn into deep forest country at the edge of their territory. Pursuing them there threatened supply collapse, since the region offered little food and the enemy could strip it bare. Caesar, therefore, chose a measured show of force. He withdrew, then deliberately wrecked part of the far end of the bridge while leaving towers and fortifications on the bank, with a sizable garrison to suggest permanence and the promise of return. As soon as grain ripened, Caesar marched into the great forest belt toward Ambiorix, driven by the need to erase the disgrace of the earlier destruction. Cavalry under Basileus rode ahead on strict instructions, move secretly, avoid fires, and attempt a sudden capture. The dash nearly worked. Basileus reached the reported hiding place before rumour could outrun him, and Ambiorix was almost taken, but luck, which Caesar himself admitted often decides war, favoured the hunted man. Loyal escorts fought just long enough to open a gap, and Ambiorix escaped on horseback. It appears that even Ambiorix began to see the struggle as unsustainable, sending word to allies to save themselves. The message read as abandonment and provoked anger. One Eberonian leader chose suicide rather than face pursuit. Others fled into woods and morasses with whatever they could carry. Some groups sought mercy and received it, though under a stern warning to surrender any Eberons they sheltered. At the Meuse ford near the old crossing, Caesar divided his army into 3 parts to widen the hunt. Baggage went to the old camp at Aduatuca, where remaining fortifications reduced the labour of rebuilding defences. A legion and cavalry stayed to guard it under Cicero. Labienus led 3 legions toward the ocean edge, to gauge conditions and strike where needed. Trebonius took 3 to devastate territory near the Aduatuci. Caesar himself moved with 3 toward the Scheldt region, aiming to corner Ambiorix near the forest frontier. The timetable was ambitious. The columns were expected, if possible, to reunite at Aduatuca on the 7th day, when rations were due. In reality, the work demanded of the detachments in such a short span resembled forced reconnaissance rather than a decisive campaign. There were no neat targets, no single army to crush. The enemy dissolved into scattered groups, hiding wherever land offered cover, striking only when isolated soldiers or small parties exposed themselves. This kind of war created a brutal dilemma. Keeping troops tightly together protected them, but it also allowed the hidden enemy to survive. Spreading out increased the chance of finding people and supplies, but exposed individuals to ambush in unfamiliar woods and marsh tracks. Caesar recognized that completing the task quickly, while minimizing Roman losses, required more hands than his own army could safely spare. He therefore invited neighboring communities with promises of plunder, drawing them into the destruction of the Eburones. The decision was framed as punishment for treachery and for the earlier annihilation of a Roman force. The result was not a limited raid, but a sweeping attempt at extermination, extending suffering to anyone caught within reach. News of the invitation crossed the Rhine, and German groups interpreted it as an opening for themselves. A force of cavalry crossed below Caesar's bridge, eager for cattle and portable wealth. Hearing that Aduatuca held only a small garrison, they decided to gamble for a larger prize. They hid captured animals, crossed the Meuse near Maastricht, and appeared suddenly at the camp. Meanwhile, Caesar and his detached commanders failed to return by the expected 7th day, and the garrison began to press for foraging. Cicero had kept men inside the walls as long as possible, but food collection became unavoidable. He made a dangerous choice, sending out 5 cohorts, likely strong troops, leaving the camp thinner than was wise at the very moment danger arrived. The Germans surged toward the Decuman gate so quickly that traders outside were caught, and the guard barely shut the entrance in confusion. Inside, disorder spread and panic rumors rose, even imagining Caesar defeated. Only firm leadership by wounded veterans and quick rallying at the ramparts prevented a breach. Worse still, the foraging parties returned to find the camp ringed by horsemen. Their response split. Some officers lacked unified control, and hesitation killed. A veteran group formed a compact wedge and fought through to the gate in good order, bringing horse and attendants with them. Another party tried to imitate the move, but did it badly, crossing worse ground and losing men to the alert enemy. With the camp refilled and the first shock fading, the Germans abandoned the attempt and withdrew over the Rhine, taking their plunder. Not long after, Roman cavalry arrived, confirming Caesar's safety and ending the garrison's dread. Caesar had returned early, bound by promise to Cicero and by the need to coordinate with his lieutenants, and he restored order before pushing out again. The hunt resumed with even harsher breadth. Allied auxiliaries scouted ahead, villages and stores were burned, and the land was stripped so that those not killed might still starve. Rewards for Ambiorix were raised, yet he slipped through nets repeatedly, moving with only a few companions and changing shelter constantly. Later, Caesar turned to political discipline again, holding a council among the Remi at their chief town. Conspirators were judged, and a principal leader was executed in a ritualized, ancient manner meant to demonstrate authority. Others fled, and allies were forbidden to offer them basic aid. Winter quarters were then arranged more sensibly than before, with legions placed within supporting distance instead of scattered isolation. Supplies were stored, and Caesar left for Italy believing the army could hold without him for a time. For all the speed and efficiency of the year's operations, the campaign revealed a dark logic. Against enemies who could vanish into forest and marsh, devastation became the blunt instrument of control. The acts were not unusual for ancient war, but their moral weight shifted with circumstance, and even contemporaries could sense the line between strategy and cruelty blur. One clear fault stood out inside the Roman system itself. Cicero's lapse at Aduatuca, though it ended without catastrophe, showed how quickly fortune could turn. Another near disaster there would have echoed the earlier ruin, and Caesar did not pretend otherwise. Even so, calm was temporary. Gaul carried resentment beneath the surface, and the absence of a single supreme commander left behind during Caesar's departures created openings for conspiracy. Secret meetings multiplied, grievances were repeated, and leaders swore to risk death rather than live under Roman demands. Plans were made to strike camps before Caesar could return and to block roads to keep him away from his legions. In the centre, the Carnutes moved first, slaughtering Romans in a major town and sending a shockwave of revolt outward. The news travelled with astonishing speed, passed from height to height by shouted signals and, when needed, by fire, a system that endured long after these events. Out of this uprising rose Vercingetorix, young, forceful, and politically dangerous. Older chiefs tried to restrain him and even expelled him at first, but he gathered the restless, the ambitious, and the desperate until he was strong enough to seize control, drive rivals out, and present himself as the leader of a national struggle. His discipline was severe, and his army swelled, especially in cavalry. Some allies resisted joining, and the political map remained uneven. But the movement spread fast enough to create a crisis Caesar could not ignore. Caesar learned of the revolt while in Italy, and once back in the northern provinces he saw the trap. He could neither safely summon his legions, nor reach them by normal routes. Messages could not pass, camps could not move without his direct orders, and no single deputy held unquestioned authority to act independently. If the legions tried to march separately, they could be destroyed one by one before concentrating. If Caesar tried to travel with a small escort, he risked capture in a countryside suddenly hostile. A secondary threat pressed at the same time. A rebel detachment stirred southern tribes and aimed at invading the Roman province along the coast. Caesar's first move, therefore, was not toward his legions, but toward securing the province, because losing it would have been a strategic disaster and a political humiliation. His arrival steadied the region. Garrisons were reinforced, emergency recruits raised, and a hard defensive line formed along the frontier rivers. The rebel thrust was checked before it could gain momentum. Then Caesar looked for a way to pull enemy attention away from his isolated legions and toward himself. He chose a winter march across a mountain barrier that few would have attempted even in better weather, forcing troops through deep snow and emerging unexpectedly into the heart of Arvernian territory. The psychological effect was immediate. Communities that assumed winter meant safety suddenly saw a Roman army appear where none should have been possible, and they called for Vercingetorix to intervene. The diversion worked. Vercingetorix abandoned other operations and marched to meet the unexpected threat, shifting away from positions where he might have trapped the scattered legions. Caesar, leaving a subordinate to keep cavalry active and visible, then executed a daring reversal. He rode hard to the Rhine, took newly gathered cavalry, and drove day and night through friendly territory into the lands where 2 legions wintered. Speed was the shield. By moving faster than rumour, Caesar reached them before the net could tighten. From there, orders went out for other legions to converge, and the full concentration was pulled off before rebel plans could mature into coordinated attacks. By late winter, Caesar had gathered his forces again at a central base, restoring the one advantage that made Roman war machine deadly: disciplined mass under a single mind. With his army reassembled, Caesar could turn from survival to offensive movement once more, pushing south to relieve threatened allies, seizing key towns that could serve as supply points, and punishing communities linked to the initial massacres. The crisis had not ended, but the worst danger had been avoided. The enemy had failed to isolate the legions permanently or block Caesar from his command. In that narrow window, audacity and speed had bought Rome time, and time, in this kind of war, often mattered more than numbers. When Vercingetorix realized how much damage Caesar was inflicting on communities still tied to Rome, he abandoned the pressure on Gergabina and marched to confront the Romans directly. Caesar, meanwhile, had just finished taking Noviodunum. The surrender was already underway. Hostages were being handed over. Horses and weapons were being delivered, and Roman officers were supervising the transfer. Then, on the horizon, the first riders of Vercingetorix's cavalry appeared. Inside the town, nerves snapped. A faction that had been ready to submit suddenly believed rescue had arrived. Gates were slammed shut, men rushed back to the walls, and the surrender was abruptly revoked. For a moment, Noviodunum threatened to become another crisis, not because the Romans lacked strength, but because a city can change its mind faster than an army can change its position. The officers on site managed the situation with discipline and quick judgment, and Caesar's cavalry struck out at the approaching Gallic vanguard. The clash was sharp, and for a brief time the Roman horse looked vulnerable. The balance shifted only when a newly recruited German contingent fought with aggressive, unfamiliar methods that unsettled the Gallic riders and forced them back with losses. Vercingetorix withdrew, unwilling to gamble his main force in a fight that did not suit him. Caesar pressed on toward Avaricum, the strongest town of the Bituriges and the best fortified prize in that part of Gaul. He believed that if Avaricum fell, the region's resistance would fracture and obedience would spread outward from its ruins. Vercingetorix, watching the pattern of Roman success at earlier towns, had learned the lesson that mattered most. Open field battles were where Rome's discipline turned numbers into slaughter. He called together the tribal leaders and argued for a different kind of war, one built on endurance rather than dramatic clashes. The Roman army, he explained, lived on grain, fodder, and the steady movement of pack animals. If those necessities could be denied, Caesar's cavalry would lose much of its power, and the legions would be forced to stretch their supply lines until they became vulnerable. The only way to make that happen was brutal but effective. Fields, barns, villages, and storehouses had to be burned before the Romans could seize them. Anything that could not be defended had to be destroyed. It was a strategy of self-inflicted wounds designed to starve an invader. If the legions remained united, Gallic courage alone could not break them. If the legions were forced to scatter for food, the smaller Roman detachments could be struck and broken one by one. The proposal hit like a curse. It demanded that people torch their own livelihoods and watch smoke rise from places their families had built over generations. Yet many accepted it, because the alternative looked worse: conquest, executions, and slavery. The Bituriges began to burn what could be burned. In a single day, dozens of settlements were destroyed. Only Avaricum was spared after bitter argument, because its natural defences were exceptional and its position made it far more likely to hold. A garrison was placed inside, and Vercingetorix established his main camp a short distance away in ground protected by woods and wetland. He avoided a direct attempt to break the siege, but he watched everything. His scouts tracked Roman movements constantly. Foraging parties were hunted whenever the risk was low. The pressure never stopped. Not with dramatic battles, but with relentless harassment that turned routine supply gathering into a daily danger. Avaricum itself sat in flat country, but nature guarded it. Marshy river channels wrapped around three sides, and only one narrow approach offered firm ground. The city's defenders understood that this single access route was the key. It forced the Romans into a siege corridor where numbers mattered less than engineering. Caesar placed his camp on higher ground, not far from the gates, with a shallow depression between camp and town that served almost like a ready-made ditch. There was no need for a full ring of walls around the city, because the marshes already sealed off most directions. The Romans had to attack head-on along the narrow approach, building up a massive assault platform, pushing protective sheds forward and raising towers that could climb toward the height of the walls. That work demanded time, and time was exactly what Vercingetorix wanted to steal. The countryside had been stripped. Food became scarce. Allied deliveries were irregular. Foraging outside the immediate area invited ambush. The soldiers endured hunger and cold while the siege engines rose. At one point, Caesar even floated the idea of lifting the siege if the hardships were becoming unbearable. The response was immediate and unanimous. The troops refused. They wanted the town, and they wanted vengeance for earlier losses. The siege continued. As the Roman works advanced, Vercingetorix shifted position, edging closer in search of a chance to strike. He tried to set a trap along routes used by Roman foragers, aiming to catch a large party in the open and punish the besiegers without risking a full battle. Caesar learned of the plan in time, a reminder that intelligence and reconnaissance were shaping this war as much as swords and spears. Late at night, he moved out with a strong force, intending to exploit a moment when the Gallic leader was away from his main camp and command was uncertain. At the enemy camp, however, the terrain revealed its own trap. The position was narrow, flanked by marshland, protected by broken crossings, and guarded at the few usable passages. Caesar examined it closely and refused the bait. The soldiers wanted to fight, but he understood the cost. Victory there would be bought with needless deaths, and even success might gain little. His goal had been to disrupt the ambush plan, and that was already achieved. The army returned to the siege lines. Inside the Gallic camp, critics began to mutter. Allies accused Vercingetorix of avoiding battle and letting Caesar work unchecked. It was the kind of political danger that can break a coalition from within. Yet Vercingetorix had the rare ability to steady a quarrelsome alliance. He spoke to their fears, reframed the delay as strategy, and turned suspicion into renewed commitment. The tribes decided to reinforce Avaricum heavily, not wanting the Bituriges alone to claim glory or bear shame. Even so, the contrast remained stark. Roman troops obeyed a single chain of command, while the Gallic effort constantly had to be stitched together through persuasion and pride. The fact that Vercingetorix could hold that fragile structure at all was one of his most impressive achievements. The defence of Avaricum was skillful and inventive. The defenders countered Roman siege tools with practical ingenuity, catching hooks and rams with ropes and dragging them away from the walls. They tunnelled beneath the Roman mound, using mining knowledge common in the region. They raised their own towers to match the attackers and protected woodwork with hides. Night raids set fire to Roman coverings and forced constant repairs. Every day brought sorties, missiles, and boiling pitch. The walls themselves were built in a way that frustrated both flame and battering. Timber and stone were interlocked with earth packed between. Fire could scorch exposed ends but could not easily spread. Rams did not shatter it the way they might a simple stone face. Instead of collapsing, the structure had to be dismantled piece by piece, and that meant time, sweat, and discipline. The Romans persisted. In less than a month, they had constructed a huge siege mound and brought their towers close to the walls. Then, at night, the mound suddenly began to sink. It had been undermined and then set alight from below. At the same moment, the defenders burst out from multiple gates, flinging torches, pitch, and fuel onto the Roman works. Night guards were caught off balance. Fighting raged in darkness, and for a time Roman soldiers had to run between towers without cover, exposed to missiles and flame. In the chaos, there were moments of brutal courage on the walls. Men stepped into positions where the previous defender had just been killed, continuing the same dangerous task without pause until the immediate crisis passed and the fire was smothered. The Gallic garrison considered slipping away across the marshes under cover of night to join Vercingetorix, But the panic of the civilians, especially the cries of women who feared being abandoned, betrayed the plan. Roman vigilance tightened. The defenders stayed. Then the weather turned. Heavy rain fell and the walls were guarded with less care than usual. Caesar noticed. Without dramatic signals, preparations were made. Towers advanced. Scaling ladders went up. Rewards were promised for the first men over the walls. When the assault came, it hit with sudden energy. The defenders were shaken back from the ramparts. They rallied in tight formations in the open centre of the town, ready to die where they stood. But as Roman troops flowed along the walls and began to close the exits, that final resistance dissolved into flight. Men threw away weapons, trying to save themselves in the crush. The Romans showed no mercy. The killing spread through the streets, and the slaughter did not spare the old or the young. Those who escaped infantry pursuit were cut down by cavalry. From a population counted in the tens of thousands, only a small fraction reached Vercingetorix's camp across the marshes. Even defeat did not break Vercingetorix, and this is where his leadership becomes most striking. In many armies, failure weakens authority. Here his influence grew. He received the survivors and dispersed them among different units, so that their grief would not ignite a dangerous wave of anger in one concentrated group. He argued that the loss proved the need for discipline, not despair. He urged the tribes to copy Roman practice in one key respect: fortify camps and treat war as an organized system rather than a series of heroic impulses. At the same time, he rebuilt strength rapidly, drawing more allies to his side and replacing losses with new recruits. Cavalry numbers rose again, yet he still refused to launch a reckless attack on Caesar's lines. He stayed committed to harassment and supply warfare because he understood that the Roman advantage grew as battles became more direct. For Caesar, Avaricum was both a victory and a relief. The town's stores provided badly needed grain and fodder, and the army finally rested after weeks of hunger and wet labour. But strategy does not pause just because soldiers need sleep. Messages arrived from the Aedui, Rome's most important Gallic ally, warning of a political crisis at home. Rival factions were battling over leadership, and the dispute threatened to pull the tribe toward instability. Caesar did not want to step away from pressure on Vercingetorix, especially now that the rebellion seemed vulnerable after Avaricum's fall. Yet, he could not ignore the danger behind him. His supply route ran through Aeduan territory. If that alliance fractured, the campaign would become a fight for food rather than a contest of maneuver. So he turned back, met Aeduan leaders, imposed a settlement, and secured promises of troops and cavalry for garrison duty along the supply line. It was a reminder that conquest was not won only by sieges and battles, but by keeping political ground from collapsing under the army's feet. With the rear stabilized, Caesar split his forces for the next stage. Labienus was sent north with 4 legions to deal with unrest among the Senones and the people around Lutetia. Caesar kept 6 legions and marched toward Gergovia, the heartland of the Arverni and the centre of the rebellion's prestige. While Caesar was managing Aeduan politics, Vercingetorix did not sit idle. He anticipated the direction of the Roman advance and moved to block it at a river barrier, taking the far bank and destroying crossings. The river was wide enough to matter, and denying bridges meant denying momentum. Caesar followed the river line, seeking a place to force a passage, while Vercingetorix mirrored every move from the opposite side, matching marches by day and camps by night, determined to hold the boundary intact. A direct crossing would have been costly and slow, and delay would have looked like submission to enemy control. Caesar chose deception. One morning, most of the army and all the baggage were sent forward in multiple marching bodies, arranged to look like the full force. Meanwhile, 2 legions remained hidden in wooded ground near a ruined bridge site. Vercingetorix tracked the moving column, assuming it was the entire army. As soon as he was drawn away, Caesar's hidden force emerged, rebuilt the bridge rapidly using the remaining supports, crossed to the far bank, and secured the position. Then, messengers recalled the column that had marched ahead, and under cover of night it slipped back and rejoined the army on the new side of the river. By the time Vercingetorix realized what had happened, the opportunity to stop the crossing was gone. He moved quickly toward Gergovia to avoid being forced into an unwanted battle. The maneuver was not a legendary river crossing on the scale of the most famous campaigns in history, but it was clean, intelligent, and decisive. It showed Caesar's ability to turn discipline into misdirection and speed into advantage. It also revealed that even a commander as sharp as Vercingetorix could be outplayed when the terrain was wide, the day was long, and one mistake in observation created an opening. Still, the larger truth remained. Without formal training, without Romans' institutions, and while holding together an unstable alliance, Vercingetorix continued to respond with the instincts of a gifted strategist. He was forcing Caesar to fight not only armies and walls, but distance, hunger, and politics, exactly the kind of war that could ruin even the best commander if it lasted long enough.